Good morning. My name is Ann Bowser, and I'm the Director of Innovation here at the Wilson Center. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everybody who came out on this rainy day, as well as the folks who are joining us virtually via the webcast. The Wilson Center was chartered by Congress in 1968 as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the nation's only president to date who has earned a PhD. Our mission is to help tackle global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. And to me, this simply means that we try to do research and build capacity to advance ideas that matter in the sense that they have strong real-world implications, including for, but not just for, the public policy community. And it's with this goal in mind that I'm pleased to co-host this workshop on using innovative data sources to understand and manage waterborne and vector-borne disease. I'd like to thank our co-hosts at NASA, both for making this workshop possible, and also for emphasizing the importance of leveraging Earth observations towards advancing disease surveillance and monitoring. I'd also like to thank Johnson & Johnson for contributing to this workshop and for sponsoring a reception following the formal programming at the Hay Adams Hotel, which you are all cordially invited to. Finally, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, who are our co-hosts and have provided important logistical support as well as decades of great programming in this area. And I'd like to thank our STIP team, especially Elizabeth Newberry and Alex Long. A lot of the focus today is on Earth observations, but this is just one source of information that we need to leverage in disease surveillance and control. The Wilson Center has been incubating a consortium of projects that do work in citizen science under the name of Global Mosquito Alert, and this was launched in partnership with UN Environment with the explicit goal of helping projects that involve the public in vector monitoring and control exchange best practices and share data. We started working with NASA through Global Mosquito Alert with a partnership that began with NASA's Develop program and a pilot project combining citizen science information with NASA Earth observations. And with this background in mind, I'm personally excited to learn more today about how we can more effectively combine Global Mosquito Alert data with a wide range of information to support better research and decision making. With this background in mind, I'll turn things over to Dorian Janney, our co-host from NASA. Dorian is a formal education specialist for global precipitation measurement and a former school teacher. Her passion for sharing the wonders of NASA's science and exploration across all age levels is contagious, and it's been a true pleasure to work with her on this workshop.
Well, thank you so much. And most of you I feel like I know, at least when I see your name tag, because of the flurry of emails that have been going back and forth and back and forth. So thank you so very much for being here. This is kind of a dream come true in a way. It's been a year in the making. I work with the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, and one of the missions that we have is applications. You know, how can you take this amazing data, being able to measure precipitation all over the world, and use it in real-world applications? We did some trainings previously. We have done a training on water. We did training on a workshop on agriculture. So we were thinking about what the next training should focus on. And at that time, I'd gotten very involved in raising mosquito larvae. I have to give you a little background. I work with a Globe Observer mosquito habitat mapper. And what we do with that is we show people how you can find potential mosquito breeding habitats and then how you can eliminate them. So, of course, I got really interested in these cool mosquito larvae and started finding different ways to grow them in various parts of my house and my yard. Now, I do empty them before they become mosquitoes. It's just the larva that I play with, but I got so fascinated in the fact that the mosquito is the world's most dangerous animal. I mean, who knew? So all of this just kind of, started to roll, and Dahlia and I had a lot of talks, and Dahlia said, I know there's some really wonderful research right now coming out with vector-borne and water-related disease and the use of NASA Earth observations to help predict, monitor, and respond to, and just better understand these diseases. I had the good fortune of being able to join John Haynes when he had a meeting last September, and I got to meet the wonderful scientists who are going to be presenting today the new and emerging research that's being done in this area. But as I got going with this workshop, I realized how vital it was to not only include and invite the public health arena, but also to really get an understanding of what their work is like, what their needs are. So this workshop today is really supposed to be an interactive, collaborative conversation that will continue to help us share, us as in the NASA remote sensing community, share, here are some of the ways in which these data are being used. Listen to what the needs are and what you kind of find exciting with all this. And then the other prong of this, which I think is really exciting, is citizen science and outreach. Because when we're talking about vector-borne and water-related diseases, these are largely diseases that if people can take certain precautions and certain actions, can be greatly reduced. So we come today with a three-sided triangle where we've got our research scientists, we've got our public health scientists and public health community, and we've got our citizen science and outreach, and we're all here today to work together and to learn from each other. So I'm really, really pleased to have everyone here today. Thank you so much. And now it is really my honor to introduce and bring up Lawrence Kadel. He is the director of the Applied Sciences Program for the Earth Science Division at the NASA headquarters, and super, super busy. So we're really, really excited that he made time to come be here with us today. Good morning to you.
Let me tell you, when GPM tells you there's a workshop and they invite you to speak, the answer is yes. So they do a fantastic job. I'm really, really pleased. Thank you very much. It's a great agenda. You know, we used to get the question quite a bit years ago in terms of NASA and health. And I have to say, it's becoming less and less frequent. And so really appreciation to whether it's you all and some of the work that you're doing in terms of getting the word out there, especially for GPM and a lot of other sort of missions. It's becoming much more sort of common. It's like, yes, of course we're using sort of different types of Earth observations. The environmental connection to health-related issues is certainly becoming more and more clear. So I know some of you are here to sort of learn more about that, and so we're excited that to help share information as well as to learn from you all in terms of where you think it may and may not be appropriate, because that's also part of it. So I don't have PowerPoint slides, which let me tell you, at NASA these days, that passes for innovation. So bear with me. So at NASA, the Earth Science program is about 10% of the overall budget and overall program that NASA has. And so right now we have 18 to 20 satellites and dozens of sensors that are looking back at the Earth, looking at the land, the ocean, the atmosphere, the ice sheets and all, really trying to understand what are the changes that we're seeing on our planet, trying to characterize them, understand them, and support maybe some predictions of them. And the nice thing about these satellites is it gives us this global view. So most of the satellites give this complete global view, which allows us to do some sort of comparisons between different parts of the world, as well as it provides us information that can get from global issues down to regional, and sometimes the data even provides information at sort of local issues. So it really provides this nice scaling opportunity. And it can pair with data, P-A-I-R, with data that people and organizations have at a much finer local level. So it's this pairing, this nesting that I think really provides a lot of the great value behind it. And so I have to say, though, that a lot of people, when we tell them about Earth observations, their immediate thought is, oh, you mean like, you know, satellite view on Google Maps. And it's really a lot more than that. Obviously, those of you who have been working with Earth observations are aware of it. But if you're not, it's a lot of the things that you can't just see with your naked eye. It's not just having a camera or a digital camera in space. Through these different sensors, we're able to see land temperature, sea surface temperature, chlorophyll, aerosols, vegetation rigor, ozone and ozone precursors, sea surface height. Again, a lot of the things that you just can't see from a visual image. And it's because of that we can turn a lot of this information and all this data into this information, into all these insights. Now, there's lots of this data. So these satellites are providing data all the time, and there's lots of it. And so there's thousands of data products. So it's a matter of trying to find, okay, which are the appropriate ones that are most useful for the need and the application. And so all of it is full, free, and open. So it's been collected and taxpayer funded, and so all the data is full, free, and open. Now that doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy. And I have to say that you're not going to become an expert in Earth observations data just by attending today's workshop. That would be nice. But this does give us a nice chance to plug that we have a training program. And the training program, you can look online. It's called ARSET, RSET. And we provide free professional level training. Some of it's online. Sometimes we have in person. And so that's one nice thing that NASA does, because we recognize that people are unfamiliar with the Earth observations. And so we provide this training to help organizations and people understand what they can and probably what they shouldn't do with the data. So we always try to be honest to sort of say, this is where it's helpful, and this is probably where it's not. But we also learn a lot from everyone who takes the trainings to understand how they're using the data. So again, if you can look up NASA and ARSET on the web. So thanks for that shameless plug. So one of the key issues is precipitation. And that is also one of the observations. You're going to hear from Dahlia next. One of the observations that we can get from space. GPM is just one of many satellites in an international network. But again, you're going to hear much more about that. But it is very much a key environmental factor when it comes to many of the diseases that you're going to be hearing about today. And so again, really, really pleased that the GPM sort of at the forefront of organizing this and many of these workshops. So in addition to the earth science research and trying to do, supporting research to understand our planet, NASA also has an applications program. And so that what we're meaning by applications is the use of all this data and the modeling and the information products to help improve decision support activities, both public and private sector. How is it that we can apply the data and encourage both practical uses and innovative uses of the data to support the decision making and all the uses? And so when I talk about it as both public and private, public is often different levels of government, and private is both companies as well as nonprofits. And so we do have some partnerships with Conservation International, Mercy Corps, Nature Conservancy, as well as a number of companies. And some of them are the likes of the Thomson Reuters, who are using the data as part of the products and services that they're providing to different sectors. I have to say that the health area has been, I would say, providing some of the most original work when it comes to uses of Earth observations data. And I would say that simply because a lot of the other areas, land management, wildfires, agriculture, they've been doing and using Earth observations, for quite a while and decades. And so they're able to use some of the higher level products or different types of products and because they're just very, very experienced in it. But it's really probably in the last 10, maybe 12 years that it's really been the reach out to the health community, thanks especially to John Haynes and all of the people in the air health and air quality program, to help broaden the awareness of where Earth observations can be used for health applications. And I really think it's the area that we see the most growth opportunities. And really sort of the environmental aspects, as you'll hear today, are sort of remarkable and really sort of undisputable when you look at that. And so we compiled a list of some of the diseases that we've been looking at over the last 10, 12 years in a number of different projects. Malaria, West Nile virus, plague, dengue, cholera, Rift Valley fever, meningitis, and probably a half dozen more, where we've been doing these projects to look at, to see, okay, is there an environmental health factor? Is there some things where information about the environment that's available from these satellites can support it? And if so, what is the role? Sometimes it may just be, a queuing to sort of say, okay, of the broad region where we can be looking, this is where you need to be going in and providing more fine-scale information at the ground. And so the different data products that we have may provide different information for different parts in the value chain and different parts in the decision-making process. And so obviously you're going to be hearing quite a bit and hearing from people who are much more expert than me in terms of how to use the observations for the specific health applications. I will say that as the Applied Sciences program, so as this Earth Science Applications program that NASA has, some of the key issues that we're facing and that we're really wanting to work on is issues of scaling and replication. And so we are doing some individual projects, sometimes through grants, sometimes through contracts or cooperative agreements. And we're getting to the end of the project and we're like, well, where else can this apply? And so if we're working with one particular state or one region in another part of the world, where is it we can replicate that project and sort of get more bang for the buck? And so that's something that we're really trying to work on. So if we invest in a project, as we get towards the end, we're saying, okay, if we can find these other areas where it might apply, we can make some marginal investments and try to get more of these applications. And so that's something that I hope the people here today will think about. As you're hearing about some of these applications, you might think about, okay, well, either in your area or other areas that you know of. So that's information and feedback that we would love to have so it can help guide us in terms of seeing where we can provide those sort of marginal investments to get more. We're also looking to sort of see how do we be more agile and flexible as a program. Again, trying to sort of see, not just oftentimes the standard length for a NASA grant is 3 years or 4 years. And sure enough, the projects take 3 years or 4 years to complete. But how is it that we can, design the length of the grant for the time it takes for the application and then provide incentives to say, well, okay, well, let's do a little bit more. Let's go to a different area. And so how is it that we can prove out the feasibility of an application in a much shorter time and then look to reinvest in that PI or reinvest in that research and applied research team to try and see, okay, where can we get these applications to go further? So that's something that, again, as you're hearing about these projects today, and if you see opportunities for them to go elsewhere, please let us know. A final thing I want to talk about is something called the Earth Decadal Survey, and I'll explain what that term is if you're not familiar with it. Every 10 years, hence the term decadal, the Earth science community asks the National Academy of Sciences to conduct a thorough review to say, okay, well, what are the big challenges in research and application when it comes to Earth science, especially Earth science from space? And so if you're not aware, the most recent one came out in early January 2018, so just a few months ago. And so we're busily digesting the 712 pages of this report that lays out what are the key observables, what are the key sorts of questions, both on the research and the science and the application side of things, that the community feels we should be pursuing. And so as NASA, NOAA, and the U.S. Geological Survey, as we're sort of digesting all this, we're making our plans, our investments for what we're going to be doing over the next 10 and more years. And two of the key observables that they said were highest priority, one of them was precipitation, and one of them was surface biology. And so I think that's quite notable for today's talk, for you all to be thinking about, okay, well, helping to chart from this broad prioritization of some of these observables to translate that into, okay, so what are some of the actions going to be? What are some of the ways that in the health area we can sort of show progress both on what's been invested on and then preparing for what these new observations might provide? And so I think there's a great opportunity for this community. So in wrapping up, I wanted to add my thanks, especially to the Wilson Center, to GPM, and to the Health and Air Quality Program, as well as to Johnson & Johnson. Thank you very much for hosting the reception tonight, and to everyone else who was part of the organizing committee for this. I want to close with a quote by Hippocrates from the 4th century BC. And he said, "Whoever wishes to pursue the science of medicine must first investigate the seasons of the year and what occurs in them." And I think generally he was talking about sort of environmental science and just sort of understanding the environment. And so whoever wishes to pursue the science of medicine must first investigate the seasons of the year and what occurs to them, back in the 4th century BC. I'd like to think if he was alive today, that he'd be a huge user of the satellite data, and that he'd be here, if not in the crowd, be giving a talk. So Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Now, the wind beneath my sails, Dahlia Kirschbaum. Dahlia is a research scientist, and she is the deputy application scientist for the GPM mission.
Thank you so much. You're so welcome. So I think that, Lawrence, thank you so much for that introduction. And I just wanted to just provide a couple minutes overview of what we're talking about here, echoing what Lawrence already spoke about, and a little 2 minutes on the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, since you'll be hearing about it in the subsequent presentations. But first, I think the most important thing is to recognize that NASA is looking at Earth as an integrated system. So it's not one precipitation data set that's going to solve all the problems. We like to think that sometimes, but that's not the case. But that we have models, we have global circulation models at NASA. We have observations of soil moisture. We have observations of sea surface temperatures and models of currents. And all of that is integral to better understanding vector and waterborne diseases. And so working with our partners, international space, public and private, we really hope that today presents a time where we can talk about the integration of Earth observations with in situ observations, with outreach, to better understand and talk together about this issue. Just a couple minutes on the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, since we'll be hearing about that today. It's following on from the Tropical Rainfall Measuring Mission, and now we can look from the Arctic to the Antarctic Circle at precipitation using a constellation of both domestic and international satellites. And so what this is just rainfall from the past 7 days, all this wet weather we saw, and it's going to remain wet for a while. You can see where it's going. But this data set is available globally every 30 minutes at 10 kilometer resolution, 0.1 degree, and it's all publicly accessible. And so we really want to highlight how this data could be useful in your applications. So I want to highlight that we have a lot of different applications areas. We had an agricultural workshop just last August, which was really interesting, co-hosted with WRI. And we're looking towards the energy sector next to see how we might be able to grow that understanding of hydropower and other applications. And so we actually have one-pagers. If you're outside, we have one-pager. So I'm not going to highlight the many different examples we have because I want to just go to the end really quickly and highlight some of the different resources for those that might be able to access. So this is from our water activity that we hosted with the World Bank. We have a ebook. You can look at below. We'll send out the links as well. And it highlights different kind of higher level observations, how we understand Earth's water. It has some interactive viewers, so understanding how you can access the data and even how you can observe the precipitation data in an interactive viewer. I also want to mention the data access. So we have a lot of different ways to access data. It's outside as well. But here we can identify where the data downloads are, as well as different ways to visualize this information. And so all of this is available at our gpm.nasa.gov website. So we also have other ways to access this information, looking at from API access, so you can directly download this to your own application. We have it supported via Esri applications, and so I think it's important to be able to access this data as relevant for your application and your community. So I'm actually going to close unless we have a little bit of time. Okay. Well. So I think the important thing here is that, we're talking about the workshop motivation. And so as Lawrence said, we have, 18 to 20 satellites and in different instruments on board the International Space Station. We have satellites that are small sats that are flying in constellations such as Cygnus, looking at surface wind speeds in the tropics. And then we have satellites looking over the poles, going in an orbit, the A-train to identify, looking simultaneously at measurements at the same point in time. And then we have satellites such as the GPM mission, which is looking at different times of the day what precipitation looks like. And so going forward, the charge of this workshop are threefold. And I think Dorian has introduced this, and Anne as well as Lawrence. We're really focusing on decisions. So what I'd like you to think about is, what decisions are you, all of you, making in your research space, in your operational, in your outreach communities? What decisions do you need to make? And how might, in the areas of vector and waterborne diseases, and then how have Earth observations either been supportive of those decisions, or where they could be made. So the third is, what are the opportunities, challenges, and barriers to using Earth observation data within this space? And so I want to highlight those 3 questions because I really want you to think about them. The excellent workshop agenda that was designed by our organizational team really focuses on engagement. And so we will have presentations, but I promise you it's not going to be death by PowerPoint, because we've instructed everybody to keep to a certain amount of time so that we have a lot of time for panel engagement. We have a team of experts in the first panel that are looking at new and emerging research. We then go to a panel looking at operational and public health applications in this space, all focusing on applications or potential of Earth observations. And then we end with a panel focusing on outreach and communication and citizen science of vector and waterborne diseases. But I really hope that you stay for the end part of the day, which is breakout sessions. And this is a time where we're going to break out across these 3 thematic areas I just talked about to really hear from you and engage with your people sitting next to you about these topics. And so what we want to know is, what decisions are you making? How are Earth observation data impacting those decisions? And where might they be helpful? So I really encourage you to exchange business cards, introduce yourself to the person next to you. I'm hoping you don't know everyone in this room. I sure don't. And that's really exciting. And so please, engage with the GPM mission and observe the one-pagers that we have outside highlighting the different areas. If there's areas of numerical weather prediction, for example, of which we work closely with the National Weather Service, National Hurricane Center, if we were looking in the agricultural space, we really want to highlight all of those different examples. So I'll be here throughout the day. Our GPM team and our Wilson Center team will as well. And so please, if you have any questions, contact us. But I just want to thank everybody for putting this together. Dorian and Anne and Alex, who have been kind of the drivers of this excellent agenda, and our other team with Bernadette. Thank you to Lawrence Friedel for giving the overview, as well as for Johnson & Johnson for helping to kind of bring in a new element to what we don't often see in the research community. And so I think we're really thrilled to have the public, private, operational, government sectors all working together. So with that, I just want to thank you. And just because we really, really like, hold on, let me get to this. Since we really like really good graphics, I have a minute, yeah? All right, I'll show you why. I'll kind of hammer home why this is important, okay? So this is the observations from the satellite data I just showed you. It's called iMerge, is the algorithm. I said I wouldn't use the word algorithm, sorry. But the power of the GPM mission and other satellite observations, but I'm biased, so GPM in particular, is that we can see 3-dimensionally through the clouds to better understand how storms or any intense rainfall event, such as today, might intensify. So if you look at this is actually Hurricanes Jose and Maria. So this is a cross-section of Maria as it was intensifying from a Category 1 to a Category 5 storm. And so you can see where it's located. You can see Puerto Rico, which is still reeling from the impacts, both from the public health sector, energy, and recovery. And so by being able to observe these storms as they're moving through, as well as how they dissipate, you can see Hurricane Jose, as it's dissipating, understanding the movement of these systems, such as what we're going to hear later from Antar Jutla, looking at cholera after Hurricane Matthew hit Haiti. As one example, we are able to better understand and ultimately better able to predict some of the breeding sites of vector and waterborne diseases. So I'll leave you with this pretty graphic just because it's fun. And thank you so much for coming today. And I will turn it back over to Anne, I believe. Thank you so much.
I'm Alex. We're just going to wait a couple moments for Congressman Foster to come into the room, and then Ann will give the opening remarks.
I have a suggestion. We can go at, you always have a tap dance when you're, are you here?
Couple minutes.
Okay, we could go ahead and show the cholera video. Perfect, wonderful. We are going to now present to you the first run of this cholera video that we've just finished up, and then it will be released after today. So you are getting the
you walked on the proverbial red carpet. We're not at Cannes, but we're close. So we've put together a series of different applications-focused videos. Ryan Fitzgibbons and Joy were the ones really putting this together, and we really thank Entar and Rita for participating. You'll see them on screen. And so the idea is to highlight how we can harmonize some of the observations to better understand cholera. So without further ado, if this works, how do we do the video?
The AV team would have to make sure that it's integrated with sound. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
And were they prepared for that? In, like,
They were not
after
prepared
lunch?
for the tap dance. Sorry.
Oh, tap dance?
So we'll just do it after lunch. When it was
Yeah. Do you want to put it? Can you put it right here? I know it's a little, you know.
I don't think so.
Well, why don't I move it to you then?
Oh, hello. Wow,
All right.
this is.
Sure.
Here we go.
All right. Well, it's not the most sophisticated. But that's okay.
Great tap dance. Thanks, team.
Decades of research and technology have allowed for better forecasting of the when, where, and how intense a hurricane will be. But what if we could predict a disease outbreak in the wake of a storm? That's the question some researchers asked about cholera in Haiti in the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew. Cholera is a waterborne infectious disease that occurs when a person ingests food or water contaminated with the Vibrio bacterium. Cholera causes severe diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and dehydration, and can lead to death if untreated. Researchers estimate that hundreds of thousands of cases are reported each year worldwide.
The bacterium is found in world oceans globally, especially in the temperate regions and in the tropics. So in the countries less developed, with infrastructure that is not the equivalent, let's say, of Europe or the United States or Canada, then the population that has to rely on river water, pond water, is at risk for cholera.
In addition to water insecurity, high seasonal temperatures followed by extreme rainfall, concentrated populations, and a natural disaster are all conditions conducive to a cholera epidemic. This was the case for Haiti in 2010.
The data that we were able to pull together showed that in 2010, it was the hottest summer in 50 years. And then, as if that weren't enough, there was a hurricane that skirted the island, but it was the heaviest rain.
And then that basically provided us with the first clues on the risk of outbreak of cholera in Haiti after this earthquake. Then we used the same algorithm with improved satellite data sets from global precipitation measurement missions after Hurricane Matthew struck that region again. And we were able to, in real time, predict the risk of cholera infection in human population at least 4 weeks in advance. We did the same thing for Yemen. We knew that there is a mass movement of human population due to civil unrest in that part of the world. And then we had very heavy precipitation. And then we immediately started monitoring conditions. And that basically converged to give us a risk on where and when this disease will occur in human population.
I think we can predict and prevent, and I'd like to see that happen very quickly in the next 3 to 5 years. And I'd like to see the satellite system to be part of the regular public health tools so that we can do prediction as well as the tracking of epidemics that's done traditionally now.
Decades of research and technology have allowed for better forecasting of the when, where, and how intense.
All right, thank you. Because we are still waiting a few minutes for Congressman Foster to come, would Antar and Rita mind if I were to put them on the spot to just perhaps give us a little more information about the detection of cholera after these? Sure. Then thank you very much, Rita. Sorry again, sorry to put you on the spot, but thank you. While we have the horse here, let's see how this is going.
First of all, I'd like to say that you did a very good job putting that together. but I will be talking in the keynote this morning about the ground truth data that we have to pull together. But I think what is really interesting is that I first had this notion back in 1980, and we used Landsat, which is kind of the primitive of the satellites, to begin to think about using satellite data to be able to predict cholera, because it is an environmental bacterium. And I think it makes a great model for dengue, malaria, the vector-borne diseases. In fact, I would call cholera a vector-borne disease because plankton is the vector. It swims, it doesn't fly. So a vector doesn't have to fly, I think. So it can come under the category of a vector-borne disease. Is Antar here? Great, you just showed up. Why don't you comment on the model construction?
So I have been working with Dr. Caldwell's group for over a decade now, and what we have been trying to do is to identify how different forms of cholera actually happen in the environment, how pathogens live in the environment, and then what are the conditions under which these pathogens survive, and then use some of the ecological variables to connect to satellites, and then develop some kind of prediction mechanisms. Because from microbiological studies, we know that there is a lag time. Actually, this should be a lead time for 4 to 6 weeks of when when the cholera bacteria proliferate in the environment, and then when humans humans can get infected, and then outbreak of disease can initiate. So we have been using satellites for satellite data to predict different forms of cholera, and we will discuss more that at 10 o'clock, right? Yes. So we have been able to classify this disease into three very distinct modes. And once we identified the modes, then we were able to develop targeted models, mathematical models for prediction of this infection. So,
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much for letting us put you on the spot. Marvelous.
Thank you again for the video intervention. And it is now my pleasure to announce our first keynote, Congressman Bill Foster from Illinois' 11th District. Representative Bill Foster received his PhD in physics from Harvard University and worked as a high-energy particle physicist at FEMNI National Accelerator Laboratory. While at Fermilab, Rep. Foster worked on the team that discovered the top quark, the heaviest known form of matter. Rep. Foster was on the team that received the 1989 Bruno Rossi Prize for Cosmic Rays and was awarded an Energy Conservation Award from the U.S. Department of Energy. During his time in Congress, he has supported key legislation, including the Affordable Care Act. He was one of the main architects of the Dodd-Frank legislation. Currently, he uses his background as a scientist as a member of the House Committee on Financial Services and the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. His time as the only PhD physicist in Congress will provide workshop attendees with a greater understanding of what it takes for highly technical science to become fully funded and actionable into policy.
Well, thank you. And but just one small correction on the bio there. I'm actually the only PhD scientist of any kind. Not only, except for there's a mathematician, PhD mathematician, also a political scientist, which we can discuss. And let's see. I guess as part of the theme here of vector-borne diseases, we have successfully installed the computer virus using the vector of the USB drive. So this is a version of a talk that it's basically a recruiting talk, trying to get scientists to spend part of their career in the political arena. It's a talk I've given everywhere from the Yale physics department to junior high schools in my district, and so it's it's sort of a recruiting speech, as you will rapidly deduce. So I'll begin by talking a little bit about me. I followed the sort of non-standard career from theatrical stage lighting to high-energy particle physics to the U.S. Congress. So I'm just another one of those. And I'll talk about what life is actually like as a scientist in Congress. There's time, some policy comments, the Iran nuclear deal, the economy, human genetic engineering, whatever is of interest and questions. All right, so let's see, at the time I first made this slide, I was one of 2 PhD scientists, and now I guess all that's left with a retirement. Vern Ehlers was when I entered Congress, I was the 3rd PhD physicist. Vern Ehlers, a very thoughtful and moderate Republican from Western Michigan, retired not long ago, and of course Rush Holt is now running the AAAS. Interestingly, there's a relatively small number of members of Congress that have business backgrounds, which came as a surprise to me. So we're basically being run by a bunch of lawyers and career politicians. That's the demographics. And if you have, this is a slide I made a few years ago, so it's a little bit out of date, but the gist is true. If you have 3 numbers that add up to 100%, you can plot them on these equilateral triangles. So if you're, if you're a metallurgist, this is a ternary alloy plot, or if you're a high-energy physicist, it's a relativistic Dalitz plot, or it comes in various forms. So this, I wrote a script that ripped through all the bios of the ruling bodies of various countries and categorized the members as either lawyers or scientists and engineers, or everyone else who I called career politicians. And you can see there's a significant separation of the different countries. You can see that if you look at China they're very close to the line representing 0% lawyers. So they're basically being run by a bunch of engineers, which sort of shows in their behavior. The European Commission, interestingly, at the time of this, was about an equal mix of scientists and lawyers and political people. The U.S. Congress is, of course, along the line for 0% scientists at the bottom. And so, just back to my personal timeline, I started out in business. When I was 19, my younger brother and I started a company that now makes about 70% of all the theater lighting equipment in the U.S. So this was at the dawn of the microprocessor era. And we started out in our basement, and then after a little while, Dad kicked us out of the basement, so we went up to my bedroom. And so, yeah, there's my bedroom. And so then when we got our first order, we moved into a tiny little metal shed in a cornfield, and now it's a great big, you can see on the right my physics books slowly falling into disuse as our company ramped up, and so I barely graduated with a physics PhD and a physics undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin. That's me on the left with, the cute little flip there, and my brother. And so this is, how many of you are old enough to remember 8-inch floppy disk drives? Okay, all right, well, that's what our system was based on, and 8-bit microprocessors. But our company did a number of things, and those of you who've either gone to or taken your kids to Disneyland will probably remember the Disneyland Main Street Electrical Parade, which is something that I designed and programmed the control system for back in the 1980s. And this ran it for more than 20 years. This ran the Disneyland Main Street Electrical Parade. Our company's done a variety of other things. More recently, the London Olympics were all our equipment. If you've ever been to Chicago, there's a bunch of fancy stuff downtown that is our company's equipment. Lyric Opera, we're probably 90% of the lights on Broadway, 50% of touring rock and roll, and 70% of just churches, schools, community theaters. The company just went over 1,200 people, and so it goes to show my secret of success in business, I always tell people, is to have a really smart little brother. And this, and so this is the company today. Actually, it just went over 1,200 people. And this is a few years ago, my brother and me, with our prototype. How many of you are old enough to remember wire wrap as a way of putting it together? Okay, we got some Anyway, so this is our microprocessor from 40 years ago now. This is a slide that shows more than anything the ravages of testosterone on the male hairline. And that's the company in the background. And anyway, so after running the company for most of a decade, I returned to my first love, which is physics, and got my PhD in Harvard looking for proton decay. Now, those of you who follow high energy physics, back in the 1980s, there was this tremendous advance where, back, I guess, in more than 100 years ago, there was a unification of electricity and magnetism, where people realized that with the theory of relativity, that magnetism and electricity were actually the same thing, with one set of equations explaining both. There was a similar advance in the 1980s when they realized that electricity, magnetism, and the weak nuclear force were all explainable by the same set of equations, and that predicted particles which were in fact discovered. So the next step, obviously, is to say, okay, now let's incorporate the nuclear force, the force that binds nuclei together, to see if we can make one so-called grand unified theory, which was immediately done by the theorist, and it had a prediction that the proton, which everyone thought previous to that was stable, was in fact unstable and was going away with a lifetime of 10 to the 33rd years. Okay, and so this got, among other people, Woody Allen very upset by the thought that eventually, his everything would disappear. This would be the way the universe would end if the proton is in fact unstable. And so if you're looking for something with a lifetime of 10 to the 33rd years, there's sort of two strategies. One is to get one proton and watch it for 10 to the 33rd years. The other one is get 10 to the 33rd protons and watch it for a year. If you're trying to get your PhD thesis in a reasonable amount of time, that second strategy is better. And so it turns out that 10 to the 33rd protons is, for example, a cube of water the size of a 6-story building, which is what we actually built for that's a diver in our pool of water. It has to be deep underground, so it was located in a mine. So we searched for proton decay in a mine underneath Cleveland, Ohio, a city that's been leading the way in urban decay for decades. So, anyway, so this, there's some Cleveland people in the audience. Anyway, so these are photomultiplier tubes, things that can see the light from a candle, 6 miles away, single photons. And we surrounded this cube of water by 2,048 of these ultra-sensitive light detectors. We did not see proton decay, which got a lot of theorists very upset and disappointed. But what we did see is about 160,000 years ago in the Greater Magellanic Cloud, a star went supernova. It blew up. And for the next 160,000 years, the pulse of light and the pulse of neutrinos traveled toward the Earth. They arrived in 1987, where the astronomers saw the flash of light, and we in our underground detector saw this burst of neutrinos. And so we learned a lot about what happens in these incredible explosions. I think they're 10 to the 56 ergs is released in these things. Everyone on Earth during this explosion, as the wavefront passed through, had about 40 watts of neutrinos passing through your body from this stellar explosion from more than 100,000 years ago. Anyway, so that was my PhD thesis, and I spent most of my career at Fermi National Accelerator Lab, which until fairly recently was the highest energy particle accelerator in the world. We smashed protons and antiprotons together to make particles that have not been around since the Big Bang. And so these are the giant underground, particle accelerators that we built there. And so I spent, basically raised my family as an employee of Fermi National Lab. And so let's see, this one, this one is, he's doing okay now. He started out okay. He got a degree in math and computer science and was doing software for a medical imaging firm. And then tragically, about 6 years ago now, he told my wife and I that he was going back to law school. And so it really goes to show that, no matter how hard you try to teach your children right from wrong, there's some chance they end up as lawyers. And so, and this one is actually being married this summer to a guy who's a year ahead of her at Stanford. So anyway, so this is what I did at Fermilab for about the first 10 years was design the detectors that you build around the collision point. So you smash protons and antiprotons together, you get a spray of particles. You have to analyze this to know what you actually got. And so this is the discovery of the top quark was one of the main, probably Fermilab's most famous discovery. It's the heaviest known form of matter, and for various theoretical reasons, probably the heaviest particle that will ever be discovered. So when we had the big congressional reception celebrating the discovery of the Higgs particle at the big accelerator at CERN a few years ago, I got a chance to congratulate all of my colleagues on having discovered the second heaviest known form of matter. So, you know, scientists are like that. And so this is just this is the way we used to do data analysis, you know, back then, where you go and you make plots and you get out your pen on your transparencies and all that sort of stuff. And so then the second 10 years, I actually started working in designing and building the giant particle accelerators. So you remember the big rings there. One of those two rings, one of the machines inside it is a machine I invented and led the teams that built the magnets for it. And so these are located down in tunnels, and so that's me with one of my main collaborators in the tunnel with all the accelerator systems where I spent big parts of my life. This is just another picture of the tunnel. And along the way, we built a variety of interesting technological things. I don't want to overclaim, but I think I am the only member of Congress that's designed and built a 100,000 ampere superconducting magnet, power transmission line, which is something we built as part of a project to build an ultra cheap accelerator. And then you have to build, if you have a 100,000 ampere power transmission line, you have to build a 100,000 ampere power supply, which is an interesting design challenge. And so spinning around on my laptop somewhere, all the CAD drawings for that. One of the last projects I did involved using state-of-the-art electronics, so-called field programmable gate arrays, to damp the beams. If you just put huge numbers of particles in these accelerators, the beams start talking to themselves and become unstable and fall out of the machine. And the way you deal with that is that you make a feedback circuit. The feedback circuit has to deal with particles going essentially the speed of light, so it's got to be very fast. And so this is the team that built and debugged that system. And one of the wonderful things about science generally, and particularly high energy physics, is just the international nature of it. And that's really, really important. I think she's from Korea, he's from England, and he's from Italy, and we lost him because of immigration policies in the United States that don't treat gay people properly. So, there's a lot of work. Okay, so at this point, there's a question I always get. Okay, so Bill, so you had a pretty interesting career in business and in science. So why on God's green earth did you decide to get into politics the way, especially the way it's practiced today? And my quick answer to that is actually that I fell prey to the family's recessive gene for adult onset political activism. This is something that actually runs in my family. My dad was he was a scientist who left science and became a civil rights lawyer, actually wrote a lot of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He got a degree in chemistry from Stanford, and during World War II designed fire control computers for the Navy, and most of the way through the war started getting these field reports of how many people were killed by his team's equipment, this week, and became very unhappy with the idea of his technical skills being used to hurt people. So he came back from the war and thought about it for a while. He'd grown up in the South and saw a bunch of things he didn't like. He saw civil rights as the great moral challenge of his generation. And so he walked away from science and went into politics. There was about 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education and before the Civil Rights Act, when it was officially the law of the land that you could not have racially segregated schools, but you had only the federal courts to go after the southern school districts and some northern school districts that refused to obey the law. And so my dad spent a lot of that decade traveling around, sort of as an advance man for the Justice Department. So he would go and visit these southern school districts and then send memos back to the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department saying that in this one county, there's one guy who, he runs the place, but he understands the tide of history. And if you can have Robert Kennedy or Burke Marshall or whoever was running the Civil Rights Division, if you can give him a call and flip him, everything will be fine. But in this other county, just forget it, bring in the troops and file suit. So it was actually reading his papers after he passed away a decade ago now, that I started thinking about this fundamental question of what fraction of your life you spend in service to your fellow man. And this is an optimization that everyone has to make, but it turns out science is of no help at all in figuring out that fraction. You just have to look at the spirit inside you and why you think you're on Earth. Anyway, so my mom also worked for, the guy on the right is Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois. And those of you who have suffered through macroeconomics may remember the Cobb-Douglas production function. It's one of the most famous papers. It's actually at the core of the giant macroeconomic models that we base our policy on. So when we were designing I serve on Financial Services Committee, when we were designing the stimulus, we brought in all these people that run big macro models of our economy and what would happen if we did a stimulus that did that or this. And so then I asked one of the presenters there if I could see the source code for his model. And he goes, and after signing some non-disclosure agreements and stuff, I actually got to see the code. At the heart of these aggregate supply and demand models is, in fact, the Cobb-Douglas production function. And the Douglas in that is Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois, who was a U-Chicago economist before he became first an alderman and then a U.S. senator. And my mom worked for him. So that was sort of an epiphany when I realized, oh my God, that A, the Cobb-Douglas production function is a really clever idea, and B, that was the guy my mom worked for. All right, so many scientists ask me, okay, maybe do I have what it takes to go into politics? And so this is the test that I give them. I ask them to pronounce this word. If they pronounce it unionized, then I tell them, okay, have a good career in the laboratory and enjoy yourself. And if not, maybe you can apply for a job with the Republican administration. Anyway, so in 2006, I stepped away from my career in science, and the first thing I did was to volunteer for a campaign. This was the one I settled on was in northeast suburban Philly, where there's truly rough and tumble politics. I had to deal with a campaign manager that I wanted to do every single job in the campaign, which I ended up doing everything, I think, except for the photo shoot, which is sort of a candidate thing. And so it was sort of confusing because you get all of these young kids who are, the heart and soul of campaigns, and then here was this 50-some-year-old guy, who had this very interesting bio. They were convinced I was a spy for the other guys, but then eventually they realized that I was sort of useful to them. Anyway, so we barely won, and one of the reasons I chose that race, it was a really close race, and I wanted to make a difference. And so we barely won by, I think, about 2,000 votes. And then I started the 110th Congress as an intern in that congressional office after we won the race. And for Patrick Murphy, former rep from the Pennsylvania 8th District. So I worked in that office for about 5 months and then went back home to start my own congressional campaign, initially against let's see. Well, that's my current district, but you don't want to get me started on gerrymandering. But that's the way it is. The guy that I was initially running against is that gentleman there, the former Speaker of the House, which I will not be talking otherwise about. But then halfway through our campaign, he quit to become a lobbyist, and then so that triggered a special election, which I was fortunate enough to win. It's an interesting thing when you start your campaign. This is, I think, our second parade ever. And essentially everyone with the blue shirts on there is either a family member or one of my friends from physics, from the laboratory. And, this is the way all campaigns start. It's the way most of them end. But, sometimes if you're lucky and it's just wonderful to work with these young kids. They are smart, they want to change the world, they have fire in their belly, and it is wonderful to work with them during the campaign and then watch them scatter off into life. Some stay in politics, most scatter off. Well, that's my daughter. She runs Senator Durbin's time when he's back in Illinois. She's his scheduler and basically runs his life. He, until recently, was Rahm Emanuel's sort of political enforcer in Chicago, which is an interesting job description. He's now a political consultant. And he is a lawyer at a big Philly law firm. And so just... when you're running for Congress, you think of things that you just don't think of in science. For example, wearing a tie. Well, first off, scientists don't wear ties. But then you actually have to think about like the messaging. So this is my favorite parade tie there. It's a Frank Lloyd Wright tie. And so it's sort of patriotic, it's Illinois. So those who interpret it as a Frank Lloyd Wright tie, they say, oh, that's Bill Foster, he's thoughtful, culture, blah, blah, blah. Those that don't recognize it say, oh, it's red, white, and blue, go USA. So it's what they call automatically micro-targeting. It adjusts itself to your audience. And then you go to county fairs and then have long discussions with your campaign manager as to whether anyone who goes to county fairs actually votes, which is still an open question in politics. And then, black churches. You know, this was one of the surprises to me, the wonderful surprise. One of the great things about running for office is you go into every nook and cranny in your congressional district, introducing yourself. So I had grown up, it turns out, within 15 miles of probably 15 black churches, which I had never ventured into. And this lady was an alderman from Aurora, was my ambassador to all those black churches, and it's wonderful. For those of you who've seen the Blues Brothers scene, you know that it is just like that. I've become a real connoisseur of the excellent bands that they have. The churches compete for having really good bands. Anyway, and then farmers were another surprise. My original district was substantially rural, and you know farmers have had it tough for the last 100 years. You know, there's a lot of consolidation driven by basically automation. But the farmers that have survived are really good businessmen. So it turns out you can have very sophisticated discussions of market manipulation or genetic technology or anything else. And it's one of the joys. But, you know, this is really, you know, what it's all about. You know, we have a representational democracy because people don't have enough time in their busy lives to fully study each issue, and so you have to convince them that if they had taken the time to study each of the important issues you're voting on, that you would be voting the way they would want you to. And that's really the connection you have to make. Anyway, so you go through all this campaigning, and if you get lucky and it all works out, you actually occasionally win. So March 8th, 2008, I won the special election to replace Dennis Hastert. And at that point, actually, so I won. That's a possibly recognizable senator and my daughter. This is my swearing-in ceremony. Possibly recognizable former Speaker of the House. My mother, my brother, me, my son, and you know, it's very often people say that no one can get along in Washington. So this is my counterexample. Sitting next to me in my swearing-in is my wife and my ex-wife, who are all big supporters of my campaign. You know, and at this point, you probably guessed which party I'm from. But, you know, being a scientist sort of, you know, that pretty much determines it there. But I do have a lot of sympathy for people on both sides of the aisle. This is right after I took office. It was within a few months of the end of President Bush's term. And now, if you are the president of the United States, you have a Christmas party. Your Christmas party consists of having your picture taken with all 535 members of Congress and the Senate and their families. And you do that every single year that you're in office. So this was the last time Laura and George had to sit through that. And they were very gracious. You know, when the cameras were on, they had very nice smiles, as you can see. But in between, you could just see they were saying, okay, this is the last time I ever have to do this. Okay, so what life is really like. You know, there's this sort of image that people have that it's all, you know, cocktail parties in Georgetown or gala events at the Kennedy Center. But for me, it's not like that at all. You know, first off, I'm scheduled up 12 hours a day, and I can see my staff already getting nervous that I have to, you know, get moving here soon to my next event. And there's an enormous amount to read. You know, your staff, as you leave the office each day, they send you a big, thick stack of paper to read and approve, and then, of course, there's emails and everything else. You know, I live in a one-bedroom apartment in D.C., and then after my last votes on Friday, I come back home each weekend where I have a staff back in Illinois that schedules me to every picnic and pancake, breakfast and everything else. And there's just a tremendous amount of reading. And yes, I did read the Affordable Care Act before I voted for it, okay, which is, it's an interesting procedure because what happens is that I had my staff member who was the real expert on this read it ahead of me. And so then, we sat there at 2 in the morning with my feet up on the desk and I'd say, okay, what's the deal with this section here? And then he would come up and explain to me the details of each section by section. And so I don't claim that I read every thing that I vote on, but when there's something really important, like the Affordable Care Act, I feel I have a duty to, to pay attention. And then, of course, you spend a lot of time just talking to constituents. All right, so then after all this, this whining, basically, the question arises, so why does anyone take this job? And, there's something that they give you after you get elected. It's called the voting card in the U.S. House. And so inside the voting card, there's a microchip that identifies the bearer as the representative of the Illinois 11th. And so here, you can pass it around. I'm going to need it back. Make sure she collects it at the end of it. I'll need it at sort of in the middle of this afternoon. So you take that card and you walk across Independence Avenue and up the steps into the U.S. Capitol and onto the floor of the House. And scattered around on the floor of the House, you have these boxes of electronics, and you put your card in the slot, and then you press the red button or the green button, and the world changes a little bit. And that's why you take the job. Everything else is just noise. And that's why you go to all the parades, everything else, and because it actually makes, 90% of what we vote on is actually not that important. We're renaming a post office. We're, passing something that we know is going to pass and be signed by the president is not controversial. But sometimes you're voting on whether or not we should, contribute $700 billion of taxpayer money to keep our financial services system from collapsing. Okay, and that makes a difference. Or providing health care, access to health care for every man, woman, and child, or not. And so it's those important votes that are the real reason. So I was put on Financial Services Committee in March of 2008. That was right when the roof was falling in. And so if you look at all the old tapes where Sheila Bair and Bernanke and Paulson came in and asked us for $700 billion of taxpayer money, you can see all the senior guys, Barney Frank and all the senior guys were in the back in the dais, and the junior people like me on the committee were right up by the witness stand, watching the sweat drip down from Hank Paulson's forehead. Or you remember the automobile bailout, where the 3 automobile execs, bless their heart, flew in on private planes to ask us for hundreds of billions of dollars of bailout money. And so then, I had to vote for that. And it is, there are times when it's really rough. Because when I voted for the automobile bailout, which right now that vote smells really good, because it saved probably 3 million American jobs in the whole auto supply chain. But at the time we voted on that, it was polling about 70% no. In the run-up to that vote, our phones were ringing off the hook, sort of with a 50-50 mixture of no and hell no. And yet I understood that, it was important to the future, the economic future of a big part of, the Midwest and our nation, that we have a viable automobile industry, and there was not an alternative. And so, it's a mixture. Most of the time you listen very carefully to you always listen, but there are times when you say, okay, I've studied this more than, and so a limited number of times I think it is your duty to actually go against what you'd get if you just polled your constituents. And this is one of my favorite pictures. As was mentioned, I was very involved in the Dodd-Frank bill. I ended up being 10 for 10 in getting my amendments in. It's actually one of the pleasant surprises of this business, even as a very junior member. If you have a senior committee chairman like Barney Frank, who understood that I knew what I was talking about, that it almost got to the point that, this is a Foster amendment, and he'd kind of wave it through, which he did not do for other members of Congress. But so you actually can have an influence even as a junior member, which was not obvious. And this is one of my favorite pictures with a possibly identifiable future senator. This is the signing of the Dodd-Frank bill. And so there's a lot of challenges with political messaging. Like everyone talks about how much they love manufacturing and how their policies are right for manufacturing. And so, but okay, as a numbers guy, let's actually look and see historically which policies have been good for U.S. manufacturing. And so this is a simple plot of manufacturing jobs. And I will leave it as an exercise for the reader to decode the color code of those arrows and try to understand the relationship between the derivative and the color of the arrow, and to understand why that might be true. So I also serve on the Science Committee, the Science and Space Technology Committee, which is an interesting place. And it is often a very bipartisan committee. I was able to convince the Republican chair of the House Science Committee, who is himself a Christian Scientist, to have our first ever hearing on human genetic engineering and everything that CRISPR, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and what that will mean for the long-term future of mankind. And so it's very interesting because, I was very worried that we'd have a visceral reaction, particularly on the other side of the aisle, but it wasn't like that. When you're talking about the long-term future, people understand the threat that this poses to, what it means to be a human, and we had very thoughtful questions on both sides of the aisle. So it's only when you start talking about next year's budget that everyone goes into their partisan corners and it gets rough. And so, this is another example. We have our weekly fights about climate change in the Science Committee. And so this is one. I think if you Google my name along with the word Greenland, so you Google Bill Foster in Greenland, you're led to some articles and a video of me questioning a Republican witness on who had the idea that somehow the scientists thought it would be a good thing if the Greenland ice sheet melted, which was and the guy was a lawyer, and so he had read something and I think charitably misinterpreted it, but anyway, and so another thing, we end up fighting about the budgets, and particularly the science budget, which used to be nonpartisan, has now become, unfortunately, a very partisan issue. Time for many, many years we've had, this was the president's budget trying to keep science funding at least flat, and proposals to cut it by 17, 20%. And this happened year after year after year. Even the last budget, which has ended up very well for science, 2 weeks out on that negotiation, it was not looking good. Because what was in play is that, frankly, there was an opportunity to do something for the dreamers. These are these young kids who came into the country without citizenship as young children. And so that if we were going to get a bipartisan deal on that, the cost of that would have been a really bad budget number. And so I was not looking forward to having potentially to decide to do something for the dreamers or to get a decent number for the science and other discretionary spending. And in the end, it turns out that there was no interest in actually doing anything about the dreamers on the other side. And so the price of getting Democratic votes for that budget deal was a very good number for science. So just, be aware that I was proud to vote for that budget, but there are other, there's a trade-off that always has to be made in these things. And lots of times you have to hold your nose and vote for things that are at least partly unpleasant. And that's the nature of things. But worked out well this year, I have to say. And so the Iran nuclear deal is another time that I was really very involved in being a scientist in Congress. During if you actually read the text of the Iran nuclear deal, there were there was a table of reactor core specifications that said, here's what exactly the Iranians have to do to their heavy water reactor to make sure that it would not be usable to make large amounts of weapons-grade plutonium. And so, Republicans, Democrats, members of Congress would come to me and say, Bill, what the heck does this mean? How do I interpret this? How do I vote on a table of reactor core parameters? And so I explained them as best I could. I spent a lot of time, trying to give them the correct feeling for what it actually means. That I think the fundamental representation was this 1 year breakout time, that if Iran keeps their part of the bargain, which they did, that we would be guaranteed that if they send the heck with it and break out of the treaty, that we would be guaranteed at least a year for a diplomatic response, an economic response, and if necessary, a military response. And that 1 year breakout time was crucial, and I spent a lot of time getting classified briefings on the details, asking, what would happen if the Iranians try this? What if they try that? Can we detect this? And I was really impressed with the way we brought in what Ernie Moniz, who I think is on the next slide. Ernie Moniz, brought in and engaged the technical capacity at the science labs in the Department of Energy in every one of these questions, detectability, what's actually technically possible. And so when I announced my support of the deal, I was flanked by Ernie and by Richard Garwin, who's helped design the first hydrogen bomb, and is just a heroic figure in working what they say behind the wall in classified things. These are assets that we have up in orbit, and the first time you get your classified briefing on the stuff we have up in orbit, it's breathtaking. A bunch of smart geniuses have thought about what's possible from orbit for a long time. And it's actually, I visited the weapons labs recently, and there are scientists there who have given up their academic scientific careers to make our country safer. And I think we have to give them the respect they deserve, because they've given up a lot. And they're brilliant, and they're doing things every day that they can't even brag to their spouses about. And this is, this is a lot. I was happy to tell them there's at least one member of Congress who appreciates what they're doing for our country. And then you have to deal with the back reaction. And, we've had a pretty wide range of technical and diplomatic competence in the org chart above Congress in the past. And so one of the nice things about being a representative from Illinois is that when the president is from Illinois, from time to time, when he's going home on weekends and you're going home on weekends, you get to hitch a ride on Air Force One, which is sort of neat. But in the end, this is what it's all about. It's a representational democracy, trying to do the right thing by the people that elected you. So anyway, at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions that I still have time for. And so I got the stage shook in about 6 or 7 minutes. Okay, yeah. Tara, yeah.
People talk about congressional hearings as theater. How's the lighting?
How's the lighting? It's pretty lame. It's pretty lame. It doesn't. We could do better, but I think having one of the lights like at the entrance of pro basketball games is probably not the way you want to walk onto the committee stage. Other.
Since I'm not paid by NASA, I'm at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins, I'll ask the question, how's the NASA budget going to roll out? Are we feeling comfortable? And the second question is, we have a lot of hardware circling the Earth. Do we do anything about bringing some of it down and putting up some of the newer stuff?
Could speakers please identify themselves as well?
Rita Caldwell, former director of National Science Foundation.
Yeah.
And
well, there's a interesting situation in the Science Committee. If you look at the districts represented by a lot of people in the Science Committee, you get the feeling that many of them are there because they have NASA facilities in their district. Okay, and this is a problem, frankly, on all committees, and there are real conflicts of interest. One of the things that we run into on the every time there is a big budget deal, there is an insistence that we never have what are called BRACs, base closings. Every year the Pentagon has a long list of weapon systems they do not want and bases that they do not need, and Congress prohibits them from considering what was called a BRAC, a Base Closing Commission, to actually prioritize and get rid of billions, tens of billions of dollars of what the Pentagon views as unnecessary spending. But because of the coalition that sort of defends each other's back, in the National Archives, there's a draft of Eisenhower's famous farewell speech where he talks about the military-industrial complex. And until the very last of the drafts, he referred to it as the military-industrial congressional complex. And so it's an interesting struggle because, you don't always get the best decisions for the country as a whole or for science when the main consideration of members of Congress is preserving jobs in their area. There's a continuing struggle between the manned space program and the program that actually does science, okay, and an interesting sort of informal treaty that happens inside NASA, to because of the sort of political importance of getting young kids excited about, okay, maybe I'm going to be an astronaut, then we tend not to really do a cold-eyed analysis of what is the actual science that is being done by keeping people in low Earth orbit. And that is, we spend a tremendous amount of money, and I think that most scientists would, not rank that as the highest priority. And that's one of the real struggles in this. We're seeing a real struggle in NASA right now about privatization of space travel, which is directly at odds with preserving jobs in certain congressional districts. And so, anyway, it is impossible to tell how it will play out. We're trying an interesting experiment now. For the first time in ever, we have a NASA administrator who does not have a technical background, and that will be an interesting experiment. I hope it ends well for NASA, but I'm worried. Yeah.
So Ray Petrichin, there seems to be a lot of at least news and concerns, at least in academics, that in a lot of the government, they're not relying on data or analyzing data. It's just a mistrust of basic truths. Is there a reason for that? Is that because there are not enough scientists in Congress and at other levels, or is just
well, some of politics? I think about that a lot. Some of the most disheartening conversations that I have are with some of my Republican colleagues, where we have these long debates, like in the Science Committee, about climate change, and we say, here are the numbers. Are there any questions? And they go, oh, you guys are just, making stuff up, basically. And then they come to me, some of them, afterwards and say, Bill, I understand. You're right about this. It's pretty obvious from the data that the climate is changing, and it's pretty clear we should do something. But I just can't vote that way in my district. Okay, and that's where you really have to me, that's where you look back and say, what is it that you are voting on? Why are you in Congress? One of the definitions of leadership that I like the best is leadership is disappointing your followers at a rate that they can tolerate. And that's really what should be done, because on all the fights that we have over Dreamers, I represent Aurora and Joliet, which have a significant Hispanic population. They come, these young kids come to me all the time, and all I can do is just tell them, this is the state of play, and I'm doing everything I can. But I'm not going to lie to them and say that it's clear that we'll be able to make their life, what every other American has. And so, it's tough because there's an urge to say, yes, we're definitely going to pull this off. We're definitely going to succeed, but it's tough. And anyway.
Ann Bowser, Director of Innovation here at the Wilson Center. I'll ask the second to last question. Thank you for mentioning CRISPR. What are the other areas of emerging science and technology that you think Congress is going to have to contend with in the coming decades?
Well, I think number one is AI. The dystopian caucus sort of thinks it's a horse race between whether genetic engineering or silicon-based life forms are going to wipe us out. I think actually, if you look at U.S. politics, the driving force, both in the Trump effect and in the Bernie effect, is anxiety over technological job displacement. This is the unifying thing that, this is what got rural America, 2 generations ago, is the automation of farming. Drop the number of farmers you need by a factor of 30, and that means the number of farm towns you need drops by a factor of 30. And rural areas have been living through that reality for the last, the last 70 years. And the problem is, it got industrial America a generation ago, and it's continuing. But now what's different with artificial intelligence is that it's moving rapidly upstream. I'm on financial services committee, so I talk a lot to big bank CEOs, and I ask them what their plan is for dealing with the incredible advances in machine learning, artificial intelligence. And they sort of hush their voice and say, well, internally, we have a plan to drop our head count by 50% in the next N years, okay, because of the AI products that are available today, okay? And the rate of progress is just breathtaking. When I couldn't stand it during the during the government shutdown, I said, okay, all right, I just have to think about something else. So I downloaded TensorFlow, which is the Google's open source AI engine, and worked through the tutorial on it. And just to try to understand, and the algorithms are actually not any different than ones we worked with in high energy physics to classify these particle events, back in the early 90s. But what's different is just the incredible computing power that you have at it, the big data sets, and a handful of really bright ideas, like this business of randomly assassinating neurons during the training, so that you won't what's called overtrain, where you get one neural subnet focusing on fitting perfectly one particular picture, and then another net that is really good at another picture, which doesn't, and then they get lost when you give them a picture they haven't trained on. Whereas it turns out that if you randomly assassinate the neurons during this training, then you have to come up with a pattern that's generally good at classifying things instead of over-specializing. Anyway, so that's a new good idea, and there are a handful of others. But it's really, this is, the threat that poses to so many jobs. If you just look at trucking as a classic example, long distance trucking is that is the biggest job description in something like 25 states. And so that when those jobs, my guess is those will be the first to fall. Long distance trucking will be the first to fall to automatically driving vehicles. And so, the challenge of retraining people who've been a trucker all their career and now all of a sudden find the market value for that skill approaching zero is really a tough thing. And so I think that is actually the dominant political challenge of our campaign, and why I need more scientists in Congress, okay? So you, and especially the younger of you in the audience, just think about, what fraction of your life you want to spend in service to your fellow man. And think about, there is a value to being in elected office at all different levels. I mean, we need scientists on the school boards, on the city councils, in the state legislatures, as well as the U.S. Congress. And there's also a huge benefit to having a really skilled federal bureaucracy. In a world where everyone is, particularly members of the other party are just, clobbering the federal bureaucracy as some sort of evil enterprise. I think it is so important to have really competent people in the U.S. federal bureaucracy. So I thank all of you who are embedded somewhere there. Thank you. You're doing something as valuable for the future of our country as anyone. And now I have to take off. I can see there is you get pretty good at reading the body language of your staff. Yeah. So Yasmin is our AAAS fellow. Any of you who are interested in putting your toe in the water here, the AAAS fellowship program is wonderful. So she's spending a year after getting her PhD, spending a year in our office, and has just been a tremendous asset for us. So anyway, thank you all, and now back to the mainstream of the.
I think because we don't want to keep you from your lunch, and we also now want to get jumping into some of the meat of this workshop, I would very much like to welcome John Haynes. And John Haynes is the program manager for health and air quality applications at NASA headquarters. And he is going to be leading this panel.
Thank you so much, Dorian. And thank you to all the organizers and to the Wilson Center, first of all, for hosting us, and to all the organizers for inviting me to moderate this panel this morning. This panel is going to be concerned with new and emerging research looking at Earth observations for vector-borne and infectious diseases. And let me tell you, the three people on this panel are the experts in that field. They are also I'm proud to say, three grantees under my health and air quality applications portfolio at NASA, who have done amazing work over the past, probably 4 to 5 years at least that we've worked together. So to briefly introduce the three panelists you will hear from today, who will each get about 8 to 10 minutes to speak to you. First, on the closest here toward me is Dr. Antar Jutla, Assistant Professor of the Department of Civil Engineering at West Virginia University in Morgantown. Next to Antar is Dr. Mike Wimberly, Senior Scientist with the Geospatial Sciences Center of Excellence, Professor of Natural Resources Manager at the South Dakota State University. And last but certainly not least, at the end is Dr. Ben Zacic, Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And to kind of go with a theme of maybe Lawrence's quote and the congressman's theme of earlier, I did find this quote, and I thought it was appropriate. We are here at the Wilson Center, the center named for our 28th president, and President Wilson said, "There is no higher religion than human service. To work for the common good is the greatest creed." And I can assure you the people on this panel are working for the greater good. So with that said, I'll bring up Dr. Jutla first. Or are we going to speak here at the podium or from your seat?
I don't know. How does it?
How do you want to do that? Podium. So come on down.
Thank you, John. So I was told that I have 10 minutes to talk, and then this is like a short version, a very technical version of it. The broader version and the history will be given in like next session by Dr. Rita Caldwell on this research. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to predict conditions that that we can use to predict cholera outbreaks in the world. So cholera is not a serious infection in the US, but rest of the world is still suffering from this disease, which is a medically treatable infection, and people should not die in 21st century. So my talk starts with this Hippocrates quote that anyone who wants to understand diseases actually should look into the seasons and winds and the water that is there in the in that particular year. And this was done. This was said in like 400 BC or something, and we are like 3,000 years from now, and we are still trying to figure it out where pathogens live and how do they survive and how do they interact with human population that leads to infectious diseases. So how do I go next? Oh, here. Okay. The philosophy of prediction of water-related diseases like cholera is to find a prediction opportunity time. And what does that mean is that there is a lead time on when the infectious pathogens like cholera, Shigella, rotavirus, these water-related pathogens survive or grow in the water systems, and then there are conditions under which humans will come and interact with these pathogens, and then there will be an outbreak of this infection. So we need to find out that lead time. And this lead time could be specific to different water-related diseases. And what we need to do is that we need to actually start some kind of like satellite monitoring system within that lead time. And why do I say that it is the satellite, that we need satellites? Because for most of these diseases, the surveillance data is very spotty. And then we just cannot get the human prevalence or incidence reports from anywhere in the world. So we need to rely, and then we do not have hydroclimatological information or ecological information on different parameters of this infection. So we need to find some alternate source to get that information and then put everything in a package and then develop a mathematical models. And these mathematical models then have to be validated with the field observations. So in a sense, what we are doing is we are taking a massive amount of data, and then we are using very localized small amount of data sets to validate and then to predict the conditions or risks of this infection. So the key philosophy of prediction of cholera from mathematical standpoint was the identification of this infection into 3 modes. So we are using satellite data and data set that was collected for over the last 30, 40 years, we were able to classify that the infection cholera, it's a diarrheal infection, it occurs in 3 distinct forms. One of them is called the epidemic mode. It is the most serious forms of this infection. It occurs in an unprepared population, and it happens suddenly. And it happens in the regions which are a little bit away from the coastal areas. And usually the pattern is that we have very warm temperatures, which are followed by very heavy precipitation, and we have conditions of water insecurity, which means that human population have, in simpler words, that means that the prevailing water and sanitation infrastructure has damaged. That implies that the humans will be exposed to these bacteria, and then there can be a trigger of this infection in the human population, and then of course there is transmission. The second form of cholera is actually the endemic mode of cholera. It persists in the coasts. So what that means is that we will see cholera cases in human population for entire year, and then during a particular time of the year we will see a peak. So this becomes a seasonal model. That under certain conditions and at some time during the year, the cholera bacteria will grow in the environment, and then it will create a seasonal peak in human population. So the endemic regions are mostly located close to the coasts, and we know that how we are going to treat this infection. So the mortality rates from endemic modes of cholera are low. Infection rates are high, but mortality rates are low. The mortality rates of human population in the epidemic modes are very high. It can account for like 6 to 7% of population, and the stuff that we are seeing in Yemen is actually a form of a epidemic form of cholera. The last mode is the mixed mode cholera. It's basically a integration of epidemic and endemic. So basically we will have and this type of cholera is seen in those regions which are which are in between the epidemic and endemic modes. And we also know that there are certain conditions that we can use to predict the occurrence of these vibrios in this mode of cholera as well. Each of these modes have very specific association with the climate variability. For example, in endemic modes, the cholera bacteria shows more association with coastal sea surface temperature and chlorophyll. In epidemic modes, it's more to do with the precipitation and then temperatures. In the mixed mode, we have more. It has to do with river discharge. It has to do with precipitation and temperature. So each of these modes is related to a very specific set of hydroclimatological processes. And we have been able to on the right-hand side, you will see that these are all the satellite products that we have been using to develop the prediction algorithms for these three types of modes of this cholera. So it's a multi-sensor approach that we are taking to tackle this infection and to prepare the risk maps on a global scale. The last I'm going to show you is the real-time application of our prediction algorithms for Haiti and for Yemen. So as I mentioned, the epidemic forms are more serious. We have more mortality, and human population is not prepared to deal with such infections. So so our hypothesis here is that if we have very warm temperature, means that we have climatologically very warm, 2 or 3 standard deviation warm temperatures, which is followed within 4 weeks with the heavy rainfall, means the hydroclimatological above average precipitation, heavy precipitation. And then it is followed within 4 weeks of water insecurity, which means that there is a destruction of water and sanitation infrastructure, or there has been in the past for this this condition prevails in the society or human communities. Then there is a very high risk of cholera. If any of these conditions is not met, then the chance of cholera is very low. The risk of cholera is very low. We have been using different NASA data sets which form the backbone of our algorithms. We are using the Meta-2 data sets to obtain information on temperature. We are using the near real-time GPM data to obtain the precipitation estimates, and then we're using data from WHO, UNICEF, and NASA's CDEC Center on human population to define a score on water insecurity. And then finally, we are able to produce a cholera risk map at a very high resolution of 0.1 degree by 0.1 degrees. There is a human interpretation involved in understanding the risk, so that's why the product is not available for public use yet. But the hope is that we should be able to do that in next 5 to 6 years, and Dr. Caldwell will explain that more on this one. Just to end, this is the May 2018 outlook for cholera in Yemen that we just informed the DFI, the UK's DFID and UNICEF this month that this is going to be the risk of cholera in Yemen, and we are producing these maps regularly for Yemen and giving it to UNICEF regularly on a test case basis. That let's see how the algorithm works in a near real time status. So you can see that the blue regions are no risk, so we do have some risk here in the Sana region. That's correct, right? So we do have some risk here, and we will see how that plays out. And then this is like for the entire month of May, and we will produce the next outlook for June and then July. With this, I would like to end here. Thank you.
And we'll have time for the panel discussion and questions here at the end. So next up, we'll bring up Dr. Mike Wimberly.
Thank you, John. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk a little bit about a couple of mosquito-borne disease forecasting projects I've been working on for a number of years now, and there's not really enough time for me to go into a lot of technical details, so I want to maybe talk more about some higher-level lessons learned from these projects that I think will be of interest to the audience. So one of the things that my group has been working on for a while now is malaria early warning in the highlands of Ethiopia, specifically the Amhara region, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner there. And we've built a system where we combine epidemiological data from the regional surveillance system with environmental data from a variety of sources, including GPM. We have environmental models that we use to generate forecasts, which you see an example of a set of control charts with forecasts here over on the right. And our current forecasting system has been running off and on since the fall of 2015. We have a similar project that is supported by NASA Applied Sciences, where we've been working in the central United States, specifically South Dakota, which many people don't realize actually has the highest incidence of West Nile virus in the United States. It's the national hotspot for this mosquito-borne disease. So here we combine data on human cases, statewide mosquito surveillance, working with a different data set here, the North American Land Data Assimilation System, bringing together multiple data sources to produce weekly forecasts. And this is something that we've been working on for about a decade now, since I showed up in South Dakota. But our current forecasting system has been running for about 2 years now. And so our group has actually implemented forecasting systems. We've made forecasts. We've been working with public health agencies. We've made some good calls. We've made some mistakes. What have we learned from all of this? One thing is that you have to start forecasting before you're ready. As scientists, I think our innate sense is that we want to perfect our models. We want to test it a little bit more, try to improve it just a little bit more. And I think if you do that, you never actually get to doing forecasting. The literature is littered with papers that present a cool model and conclude that, it would be really great if someone else took this and made it into a forecasting system. So I think Ray Bradbury's quote of jumping off the cliff and figuring out how to build your wings on the way down kind of, I think, encapsulates our experiences. So, and by starting the forecasting, even if it's not perfect, you learn a lot. You've got to do a lot of work developing the technical foundation. The stakeholders actually get accustomed to forecasts in the way that we're accustomed to looking at weather forecasts on our phone every day. And through that, you gain feedback. And when they start to see the forecasting system, what it might be like, you start to get higher level feedback from them. The technical challenges should not be underestimated. So this is for our epidemia system, the malaria forecasting system. There are a lot of information system, computational components that link the human side, the collecting the malaria surveillance data to the satellite data. I'll just point out that, for those of us who work with earth science data, we know how to handle it. We know how to go to the archives. We're experienced in processing and wrangling the data, but don't underestimate how completely inscrutable that is to people who are on the public health side. When you say, oh yeah, you just go here and grab the data and you're good to go. You've got to build an informatics infrastructure so that you can, as they say, they used to say in the commercial when I was a kid, you got to get up and make the donuts every week. You got to make the forecast, and that's got to be there. Part of that is integrating Earth observations with public health surveillance, and I think that is an important theme. So if looking for a pathogen in a landscape is like looking for a needle in a haystack, we can get different looks at the haystack from different data sources. We can look with a mosquito-borne arbovirus, for example. We may trap mosquitoes and test them. Or we can look at the wealth of NASA products that we have that can give us information about the environmental risk factors for these diseases. And, so mosquito surveillance gives us a very accurate, very precise look at some very small portions of that haystack, whereas the environmental data gives us a picture of the whole haystack, but we see it through a filter. But the idea is that if we put those together, we can reconstruct our haystack a little bit better. And one specific example here is, these are just some simple scatter charts that are observed versus predicted, annual predictions from our model of West Nile virus in South Dakota. And you can see that if we only have the mosquito data, it works reasonably well, but we kind of hit an asymptote up here. There's something that we can't tell much about what's happening on the upper end, the really high years. With just the meteorological data, we can kind of tease apart the low years from the high years reasonably well, but we can't tell much more than that. When we put them together, we get what I think of as, it's sort of like the Reese's peanut butter cup of forecasting models. We put them together and we get something that is better than either of them alone. And I guess the other thing that I would point out is that when you're talking with folks on the public health side and you're trying to explain to them, why should you care? Why should you be interested in incorporating Earth observations? Surveillance is where you make the connection, because public health understands surveillance. They understand, doing long-term data collection. And when you start saying the S word around them, and they're like, oh, okay, now we understand. You do surveillance too. And if we put these together, we bring this into our surveillance system, we can see how this would work. And of course, part of all of this is the broader enabling environment. It's more than just the technology. It's the human side as well. It's building teams, doing training, getting people engaged and keeping them engaged in the work. So, and for people who are, tech-savvy introverts like myself, this is something that we continually have to remind ourselves. It's not just build it and they will come. We've got to cultivate the they along the way. Part of this is, I think, explicitly communicating why disease forecasting matters. You know, why is this important beyond just having scientists who like to model and predict things? You know, so I guess the way that I think of this is that right now, in almost all cases when we're dealing with a vector-borne or just about, or many types of diseases, we kind of confront the problem with a nice box of very useful but imperfect tools. And we have limited resources. So a lot of the challenge is figuring out, okay, which tools do we use and where and when do we apply them? So let me just put out an example here for West Nile virus in South Dakota. So with West Nile virus, you know, tracking human cases is not a good indicator of risk because there's such a long time lag in the surveillance system. We really don't know how many human cases we have until after most of the infections have occurred. If you look at the mosquitoes, what happens is if you look here, these are our vector mosquitoes. This is the average seasonal pattern of vector mosquitoes in red, and then Aedes vexans, which is a common nuisance mosquito, which is the blue dashed line. So with Aedes vexans, there tends to be more of them, and then they peak at a different time than the vector mosquito. And mosquito control tends to be very responsive to public complaints about mosquitoes. So what we've seen in South Dakota time and time again is that the times when an epidemic is building up, those are the times where it hasn't rained all that much. And no one sees many mosquitoes around. No one's getting bitten. No one's complaining. So that's why we need the forecasting tool in order to be able to to perceive that risk that can't be detected otherwise and get the right tools in the right place at the right time. And finally, this would echo a comment that was made earlier. A key thing is staying in the game, particularly for scientists who operate in a world of 3 to 5 year long grant cycles. So I'll just tell a quick story here. West Nile virus, 1999. West Nile virus is here. What's going to happen? 2001, this is sort of like the 6 stages of West Nile virus. Stage 2, fear. It's going to spread. Then on the rampage, it's like 2003, it's exploded across the central U.S. We're freaking out. What's going to happen? 2007, that was pretty bad, but the world hasn't come to an end, and I guess it's here to stay, and we'll figure out how to live with it. But then around 2010, everyone kind of forgot about West Nile virus. We had a few low years. By the time 2011 rolled around, you couldn't get anyone to talk to you about West Nile virus because everyone was interested in influenza and other things. It was like, oh, yeah, that thing. That was, everyone's got immunity to it or something happened. It's mutated, something's happened. And then suddenly, 2012, it roars back and we have the biggest year ever. What happened? And then we have a new West Nile virus freakout that is now kind of faded into our memory once again. So, part of the challenge is, and, for us scientists, we have to be a little bit scrappy and figure out how to stay in the game to keep these types of systems implemented once we've developed them. And with acknowledgments to many collaborators, that will be the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And finally, we'll have Dr. Ben Zacek. And have you come up, Ben?
Great. Thanks so much, John. Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to talk to you today. So building on what Mike was just telling us about, I'm going to stay with the mosquitoes and talk about one specific case application we've been working on in the Peruvian Amazon and the Amazon of Ecuador now. And I think Mike just made some excellent points about all the things that our perspective as Earth scientists need to do to reach out, to engage, to make these systems effective in the field. And I'm going to take a slightly different angle on that, much the same theme, but kind of recognizing what we can't do and therefore what we need to work on from the technical side, okay, not the outward side, but the technical side. And how do we address that? And so the basic motivational question here is, can Earth observations help us with either predicting or informing interventions. And those are two separate questions, right? And so I'm going to lead that with three kind of propositions that have guided our work under the NASA program. The first is that vector species, in our case, particular mosquito species, are sensitive to land cover, climate, and hydrologic conditions. These are the kinds of things that we observe fairly well, and in a way that is unique, as Mike was pointing out, from what might be available in traditional surveillance systems. And I think that what Antar and Mike have already shown us and what we might already anticipate is that, yeah, we can do that. The second question is, proposition is that these same variables can contribute to malaria risk prediction, and that's a different proposition, right? I mean, knowing where the mosquitoes are is, when we declare victory sometimes, and is, of course, only one very small part of the process, and we're getting a little more distal from the original Earth observations if we want to answer this question. And the third, very, very separate proposition is that these transmission processes, the risk, is sensitive to some kind of interaction between individual behavior or group behavior and the environment. And from there, I'm trying to take that leap from can we monitor this stuff, can we predict it, to can we actually inform an intervention? And that the proposition is that to do that, we're going to need to understand both the human side of the system and the natural side of the system. And I don't know how to do that myself, right? And so that's where I need to be reaching out to figuring out how the Earth observation tools interact with other disciplines. So just to make this a little more specific, here's where we're working. And so this is Peru here. This is the Peruvian Amazon, and the borders don't mean much between Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and part of Brazil there. This isn't showing up very well in this lighting. What I'm trying to show here is an area on the Amazon River, and there are lots of dots here where hardworking people have been collecting and doing species-specific typing of mosquitoes for the past 20 years. Okay, so we know where the mosquitoes are, when they're there, and what species they are. So this is we're going after the vectors, right? And then we can do kind of classic, Earth observation and take some satellite imagery, classify it into different kinds of land cover types, do our good solid ground truthing, send students out there with GPS and mosquito repellent, and then try to figure out what the relationship is, okay? And what we find is that in this area, for every 1% increase in cleared land area, this is an area of active deforestation, you get about almost a 4% increase in the odds of finding your primary vector species, Anopheles darlingi. Okay? And that's very species specific. You get fewer mosquitoes with the cleared land, but you get more of the vector species because it's a different niche. And so understanding that level of entomological detail does matter, as Mike was pointing out with respect to control strategies. So that's great. So we've done a land cover mapping that is uniquely capable of because of Earth observation. We find out that there's a relationship with land use. We then take some other NASA assets. In this case, it's a land data assimilation system in which we're integrating satellite data with some physically based hydrologic models to get soil moisture estimates. And then, apologies for the small font here, these are all different mosquito species. And over here are the ones that are the active vectors in our region. And what this is showing is that there's a negative relationship between soil moisture and presence of those vector mosquitoes in our area. Not for all species, but some species. So in other words, this is a wet area. It gets too wet, their breeding habitats get washed out. Okay? So it's very contextually specific, but it's interesting to find that that's going to be the climatic driver for us in this particular area. Okay, so we can find the vectors, we can kind of predict them. Malaria risk gets a little tougher, right? And so now what we're doing is we're looking at the whole state of Laredo here in Peru. We have our great Earth observations, that we can map out and forecast to some extent. And then I have to work with my epidemiological colleagues to say, okay, can we do some fancy epidemiology where we say, okay, that the probability of malaria is going to be a function of the current malaria rate, right? We have an autoregressive model, which is the current monitoring system. Land cover conditions, and some set of coefficients that we're going to set with these climatic environmental variables as well as other factors. And we're going to need to look at that at the regional scale, the sub-regional scale, and at the district, which is our most local scale, because the processes are operating differently there. So knowing when the state needs to get on alert is different from knowing when a hotspot district is going to pop up. Okay, and we find that we need different kinds of models that use the same predictors but in different relationships between them to get at that. So here the Earth observations are relegated to the position of a useful but not solitary input. Okay, I can get you mosquitoes pretty well as an Earth scientist. Okay, I can't get you malaria as an Earth scientist. I need to be working with people who understand the human system side. And finally, that becomes really complicated when you get to the actual interventions. Okay, so even if we succeed in perfect monitoring prediction of the hotspots, it doesn't tell you what to do necessarily. Okay, and to get at that, we need to understand the interventions. And to understand the interventions, one approach we've taken is an agent-based model. Okay? And the idea here is to use the Earth observations now kind of relegated even further, right? We're going to be one part of understanding a complicated human-driven system in order to understand what might happen if you start spraying for mosquitoes, or what might happen if you start doing human-centered intervention strategies. Okay, so these are our adorable little agents, one of whom unfortunately has malaria. And then you look at the household scale. Okay, you also look at the village scale, so that we can have separate villages of these agents, and we do all the hard work that people do when trying to understand individual and group behavior, like tracking movements, doing household surveys, as well as household monitoring of the disease, to understand exactly how people are interacting with each other and with high-risk zones. Maybe there's a river there. Maybe it's raining, there are puddles and breeding sites forming. There's also temperature that's variable, that's going to be influencing both the plasmodium in the case of malaria, as well as the mosquito and human behavior. And then you got mosquitoes flying around. Some of those mosquitoes, if you see some of them are infected, some of them are red, and some of them are black. Okay, so you got different mosquitoes as agents. You got human agents, you got mosquito agents that respond to natural and human-built environment. And then you got the plasmodium itself in PowerPoint form. So that has its own sensitivities to the environment. Okay, and so if this looks like a mess, it's because it is. And so you end up dealing with these cross-scale interactions, again, of which the environment is interacting in different ways with these processes. And so then what we do, we go back to me as the earth scientist, I talk to our epidemiological colleagues, and they say, okay, we need to know the river level, we need to know soil moisture. And it's like, okay, good, that's back to something I know how to do. And so we can work on this looking at the river levels from altimetry or from a simulation, soil moisture, again, from this data assimilation system that's taking the NASA satellite assets together with a model. And we do pretty well on that. We can then get the seasonality and interannual variability and use that to try to drive agent-based simulations. Now, I should be clear on this, and if there are any people who do this in the audience, you know this. Agent-based models are not good predictive models, right? That's not why you do it. You don't do it because you're trying to get, minimize your root mean squared error on your number of malaria cases. You do it because you want to understand a process that then allows you to look at an intervention when something happens that's not in your observed data set. The idea here, right, if you believe it, is that by going after the whole integrated system in an agent-based way, you can understand how behaviors and changes in behaviors will influence your outcomes in a way you haven't seen it yet. Okay? And so that's what we're doing this for. And then once you do establish that you've got some realism under current conditions, you can say, okay, in this particular village on the Amazon River, perhaps there's going to be something like a spraying campaign, just to give you a simple example, right? So what is that going to mean? So for your total malaria burden, as well as your Vivax and falciparum, what happens if you go to a certain radius around zones of human activity, okay? So if you start off with 0 radiance, then you wouldn't do anything. And here's kind of more and more extensive spraying activities to try to keep the mosquitoes away from the people. And you can kind of look at what you would expect your extinction curve to look like as you do more and more aggressive control. Can you drive this down? All right. Now, we haven't observed that in this village, right, because it hasn't been done yet. But the idea here is that by using the Earth observations to tell us a little something about the environmental conditions, right, where the breeding habitats are likely to form, how sensitive they are to seasonality and interannual variability, merging that with some non-Earth observation information done by, working with the village to understand the processes there, you might be able to bring those together to actually understand an as-of-yet unobserved intervention. And so that's, I think, what we're finding, at least in this case, and more as I'm working with folks in the intervention sphere, is kind of understanding that the critical but component role that Earth observation plays, and the more that we can get Earth observations into that kind of analysis pathway, the more powerful the Earth observations become because they're being folded into this more extensive and in some ways more human-centric view of the vector-borne diseases. So just those were the 3 propositions of our study and kind of our approach in general. We're still working on them, but I think that as you go down that list, you can find there's a role for Earth observations in all 3, and that role gets smaller proportionately as you move from the top to the bottom, but perhaps more powerful in terms of its ultimate public health income. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And so before we open it up to questions from the floor, a couple questions that I wanted to pose to the panel to get the juices flowing, as it were, is looking at your background, your knowledge, your expertise in the respective fields of infectious and vector-borne diseases and the utilization of Earth observations for risk characterization, prediction. Where do you see as the next emerging opportunities or maybe emerging threats where Earth observations could be brought to bear in these areas. So, don't all speak at once.
I guess, one thing that none of us talked about was the wide array of arboviruses that are vectored by species like Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, and this includes dengue as well as Zika, which has been at the forefront of our, some of our recent vector-borne, I guess our more recent kind of public vector-borne disease freak out. So I guess I would just put that out there as one example. I think one of the challenges that when people look in from the outside that they don't realize is that, mosquitoes are not all the same. The culicine mosquitoes that vector West Nile virus versus the actually wide diversity of anophelines that vector malaria versus Aedes aegypti. Their ecologies are all very different. And the ways that the Earth observations can be used to model them and to support public health interventions are going to be different. So I think that's certainly another area that wasn't covered by the panel, and I think there are a lot of opportunities there for us to contribute as well.
Antar, Ben?
Yeah, I actually agree, and the same thing is actually true for water-related infections as well. So we have other Vibrios like Vibrio vulnificus, Parahemolyticus, and harmful algal blooms along U.S. coast and along major tropical belts, which pose a continuous challenge to spread infections in human communities along coasts, knowing that like 60 to 70% of human communities live within 100 miles of the coast. So as there is variability in sea surface temperature and melting of ice and all those kinds of stuff, we are still very far from understanding how these infections or the agents of infection will appear, reappear, or they may become extinct from one region to another region. So in other words, like where are going to be the new ecological niches of different water-related pathogens in the world? So I think that's the scientific challenge. But there are other Earth observation challenges as well. Like that's we're going to discuss the Earth observation challenges next, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Ben.
Well, just briefly, maybe I'll go with an easy one because those are hard. And that's, I think that there's been, people kind of already know this, but it's not necessarily communicated or synthesized effectively. And that is, we are in a good position to look at how environmental change influences the physical and biological drivers of, various infections. But that has led, I think, to some, to steal a Wimberley phrase, freaking out. That is not always justified, right? Because it's we need to do is put together with understanding of what the vulnerabilities are. So the CDC recently, not officially, someone at the CDC recently made this point about zoonotic diseases versus diseases that don't have a non-human reservoir. And so if you're talking about what should we freak out about in the United States, something with a zoonotic reservoir, primary reservoir, is much more of concern because we are pretty good. There's no wood here, but we're pretty good at managing things that have a human-only reservoir, because of our level of, fortunately, of development right now. And so if you're going to worry about the next big outbreak, maybe what you should be worrying about, or the next emerging new reality of a disease we have to deal with endemically, maybe we have to think about how those environmental systems, or how the Earth observations tells us what's coming in, and really think in an intelligent way about what the potential is in our social context for that to take root, versus saying, it's coming up north, it's coming north, and the next map you have says that under climate change we're all going to die of cholera. It's like, that's not going to happen, right? That people aren't that. People are smart about it, but I think that maybe that sometimes doesn't get communicated, the nuance of it. And if we can just be a little bit more systematic in how we bring that together, we could not only maybe avoid good science that is end up being misinterpreted as being alarmist, but also help bring a finer point to things that we really do need to be watching.
And I think that what you just said about the knowledgeably utilizing Earth observations, knowledgeably utilizing these products and these data to have good science and not have alarmist or hashtag fake news out there, where people say, oh, when I've seen these stories before, what you said, where I have seen actual stories in the media that said under climate change scenarios, malaria overtakes the United States, which that's, as you said, not going to happen because of many socioeconomic and other factors that come into play. But if you just ran pure climate model and threw in mosquito vectors, well, yes, but guess what? Malaria existed in the United States all the way up until we formed the CDC in Atlanta in the 40s to stamp it out finally. So, of course, it could be here, but thanks to air conditioning, keeping our windows closed, that broke the cycle. But you're getting into what a question Antar alluded to on challenges. So I would ask you also, so on the flip side, not only, and maybe not even specifically with your research and with applied research, but what do you see as the biggest challenges in the utilization of Earth observations for decision making, for risk characterization, for forecasting, in vector-borne infectious diseases when you're talking about working with the end users that you all work with, working with the stakeholders, and expanding that community to new organizations and new decision makers? What are the barriers?
I guess I'll just reiterate that data access is still a barrier. And when I started working on this, getting into this stuff about a decade ago, and that was something that we recognized then, and I think I naively thought that, we can all write some code and access and process the data, and that should be a pretty easy one to solve. But again, most of in terms of the way that access is provided to earth science data, it's aimed at earth scientists, which makes sense. But I'll just reiterate to someone in a state health office, for example, those data streams are still inscrutable, and they generally don't have the personnel, the time, the resources to tap into them in a way that they would need to support surveillance, which is basically, something that's automated, being able to go to a dashboard and say, okay, here's what I'm seeing coming in from the other sources. Let me look at some temperature indices and some risk factors for Lyme disease or West Nile virus or something else. So I think it is that's a surmountable challenge, but one that we haven't, I think, directly addressed yet, or addressed in a way that is, broadly applicable to a large number of end users.
Yeah, I've always said the kind of flow chart that goes from data, which Lord knows we have all the data you could want. I mean, talk about big data. How many gigabytes of data do we have on Earth observations? And that data, we make products from that data. And those products convey information, but it's the last jump. That information has to become knowledge. That information has to be utilized to become knowledge in a way through building of capacity in the community so that, again, good decisions are made and not knowing just enough to be dangerous, if you will. Mm-hmm. So it's the leap from information to knowledge that as you alluded to, I think that of getting that huge amount of data into the decision, the information, the knowledge you need to make the decision, that downscaling is huge. Antar? Yeah.
In addition to data access, this actually leads to trust issues with stakeholders, because if one of the data sets has a particular X format, and then the next data set is out there with Y format, then they start to question that why was the data changed? And we know why was the data changed, but stakeholders will start to ask questions, and I have been asked these questions, that why the data set was changed. Why don't we stick to the old algorithms or old data formats? If we lose that trust, we are in a real mess. Mm-hmm. So, the formatting of data set has been a huge challenge. Like every time there is a new product, they will change a format. So it's just it would be easier for us to communicate with our end users if there is a consistency that is maintained. The second challenge I think that we all have, or at least like for us, is the latency time of some of the products that we are using. The latency time of like 4 to 5 months or like 2 months will basically imply that there cannot be any predictive, or there cannot be any models that can be built with that lead or lag time. So I think latency times are also one of the challenges. The spatial resolution of data sets is becoming, it's improving. We, at least from our perspective, that we are still very far away from an ideal spatial resolution. So, so as we will have new satellites or new products, we should be able to get hold of better spatial resolution for these products. Those are the challenges, I think, technical challenges that I think we will be facing, and we are facing. Ben?
Yeah, I won't add much. I think those are great comments. I think also putting it where people know to look for data. So it's not just on, NASA can have the best website in the world, but that's not going to help if people are used to going somewhere else for the information. And so we need to get it into their toolbox.
So now I'd like to open it up to the floor. If we have questions for our panelists. Yes, right here in front.
If you could please start by stating your name and organization, please.
My name is Tilanka Manasinghe. I'm from West Virginia University. My question is, after we get all this data from, let's say, hypothetically speaking, we pick up a country like a developing country, then we get the data. We need to, after we integrate the algorithms, how do you do the verification and validation with that? That I see there's a gap between, we need to place some stepping stones. What are the actions that we should take collectively to overcome this obstacle? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, I guess I would answer is that if you actually build an operational forecasting system, one of the advantages is that you can build the validation into it. So for our malaria early warning system, the surveillance data gets uploaded every week, most of the time. But, in principle, that's how it works. And we are actually, every week we make a real forecast. We push forward a forecast into the future. And all of that is stored. So I think that's one of the advantages of operational forecasting, is that from a technical standpoint, you can build it right in. Now, there's a broader question that I will not get into about, what is the right way to validate a disease forecast, and what does it mean to be accurate, and how accurate do you have to be useful? I mean, I will just make one little point here, that going back to the example of weather forecasts, most of us look at a weather forecast every day. We find it extremely useful. I would guess almost, except for a few of us maybe, none of us could say what the root mean squared error is or recite accuracy statistics. But because we're used to it, because we look at it every day, we have an innate sense of what the accuracy is. It's like, yeah, I believe tomorrow's forest forecast for rain, but maybe not 2 weeks out. So I think part of it too, going back to what I said in my talk, is just getting the users engaged and paying attention to the forecast, and then you get sort of a qualitative as well as a quantitative validation.
All right, one more question from the floor. And I think in the back. And please state your name and affiliation.
Hi, Trip Corbett, NASA Account Manager for Esri. Each of you mentioned the challenge with data access and data formats, and NASA is obviously a very large organization. So where would you say that the data access problem should be tackled first? Would you say that it is by the applied scientists who are developing applications for those end users, or by the data centers that are storing the data who are then enabling the applied scientists? What would you guys say is the cart, and what would you guys say is the horse, or given the large community of end users you guys work with, as well as yourselves as scientists?
That's a difficult question, but let me let me give my 2 cents on this one. For a very long time, NASA had Mod 12, the Landsat temperature product, out. So we were using MRT tool to get the particular tiles for obtaining land surface temperatures. The information on tile coordinates were not available on the same website. So there was no way for us to actually know that what were the coordinates for the tiles. So that becomes very challenging. A universal data format will be an ideal stuff, but I understand that sometimes it may not be possible. But again, like going back to land surface temperature, the MRT tool was very clumsy. So we couldn't process a large amount of data sets because we need to prepare the time series. So if we know that there is an algorithm that has been developed, there is a program that has been developed, it's on the website, we can just take that and run it our own data centers. That'll be helpful for us. I think for public health professionals, like a Giovanni system is one of the good examples, and in my view, that actually provides some kind of visualization or visualization capabilities to people who don't know what NASA data looks like. So something along that lines, plus a universal format of data sets, and if there are any codes that are developed, that we can just pull it off the website and then use it. Like you said you're from Esri, right? So Esri also had Esri built a component to export the NetCDF into the ArcMap. For a very long time, there was a bug there. I mean, the system used to crash. So a more streamlined, strengthened, bug-free program would be helpful. I know right now the NetCDF tool is pretty reliable, but it becomes very data intensive, very computationally intensive if we have 1-2 gigabytes of data sets within GIS environment itself. So that's my take on it.
I would just quickly add that I think one way where I can see a path forward is via some of the newer cloud-based applications. So I'll mention Google Earth Engine, for example. What we found in our projects is that in terms of getting data into the hands of an end user who wants to be able to specify an area, a date range, and say, okay, I want a data table with this information in it that I'm going to drop into a model or doing something with. You can write a script that has a little interface and build it, and build that, send it to them. If they have an account, they can enter a few things, click, download a data table, and it works. I don't work for Google, and I'm not necessarily saying that we should pin all our hopes on one tech company. But I do see that as, I think, maybe an example of how we can move forward, where we can look at ways of harmonizing data in the cloud and then giving end users, ready access to just the data that they need. All right.
Well, again, let's give our panel a round of applause. Thank you all again for joining us, and I will now turn the podium back over for our keynote speaker.
Well, wonderful. And we got a little bit of a preview when Rita kindly helped us out with our tap dance earlier. But now we're going to hear from Dr. Rita Colwell. She's a distinguished professor at the University of Maryland at College Park, as well as the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. So we are really pleased to have Rita, who will now be giving us a keynote presentation.
Thank you very much, Dorian and John and all of the team at NASA for putting together this terrific workshop. It's really, really very helpful, and I think it bodes very well for the future. I think we will find that the tools that are being discussed and being developed will change public health, global public health. I'd like to give some background to the cholera and to waterborne diseases as an area of public health that we can use of the climate and satellite sensing as a really important tool. The numbers of cases per year of waterborne diseases are in the millions, and the numbers of deaths as well. These are just some of the major waterborne diseases, and I will be discussing a little bit later some of the more, let's say, refractory diseases to be able to predict, such as Salmonella, Shigella, and some of the major causes of diarrheal infections. But I think, first of all, cholera, which we've been talking about, is a severe dehydrating diarrheal disease where fluid loss through vomiting and diarrhea, if not replenished, will end up with fatality. The bacterium is a simple curved rod-shaped single flagellum cell, and it's easily cultured in the laboratory. How we were able to use satellite imagery to predict is because we discovered about 30 or 40 years ago, work that my own laboratory had done, was that the bacterium is associated with plankton. It's associated with zooplankton, the animal component of plankton in the world oceans, rivers, estuaries, ponds, etc. And this work was done in the Chesapeake Bay, showing that the association was very clear and direct. Whether it's symbiotic, we're not quite sure, but it's certainly commensal. It turns out that all Vibrio species have a chitin digesting capability. They break down the N-acetylglucosamine, which is the hard shell structure of crabs and shrimp and the microscopic animals in the plankton families. We also learned very quickly, 20 years ago, work done at the University of Maryland, that these bacteria go into a dormant stage. They have a seasonality, which is really very important. And the dormant stage is because of its relationship to the zooplankton. Excuse me, the zooplankton go into a diapause. They burrow into the sediment in the winter, and they go into a kind of a stasis. And the bacteria that are part of their natural flora do the same thing. They go into essentially what is a rounded up spore-like stage, but without a spore coat. Now, we've also been able, let's see, what have I done here? Okay. So this summarizes some of the very early work back in the 70s and the early 80s, and that is the first responders to spring months, at least in the temperate and the tropical arena, is increased temperatures, increased sunlight, the phytoplankton and the algae bloom, and is followed by a zooplankton bloom, which grazes on the phytoplankton. And then when the zooplankton bloom crashes, it releases lots of Vibrios into the water column. And then those who, in the developing countries, who ingest water without any treatment, just straight from ponds, will then come down with cholera because they will ingest sufficient numbers of the bacteria to have the disease. We have known from work done by others, not I, but others at the University of Maryland Medical School some 50 or 60 years ago, when you could do this kind of experiment, with human volunteers that it takes about 1 million cells per milliliter, per teaspoon, if you will, ingested in order to have a case of cholera. If you ingest maybe a few cells, you might have a mild diarrhea, but you won't have a full-blown cholera. So it's a dose-dependent disease, and I think that is an important factor to remember. Now, the work in Bangladesh began in 1975, and it's been very extensive, particularly working in the south, in the Sundarbans, and sites shown in the slide have been studied for the last 40 years, and we've been able to compile huge amounts of data. This is from a paper that just appeared last month, showing that in the winter months, in the top left, the bacteria are in a biofilm clustered together, and it also provides a protection where they're in this kind of dormant stage. But in the spring, the biofilms disaggregate, and the cells are released into the water column. And then in the monsoon summer months, there's again a biofilm clustering in the water system, and in the fall, again, a breakout after the plankton blooms. So we're able to actually monitor the changes and the formation of these microcolonies, these biofilm formations, and the communities that comprise this cluster of cells. This is important because, again, the association with plankton and the fact that you can get large numbers of cells that can be infective sufficiently to cause cholera is aggregated into the environment under natural conditions. And we can actually see on different kinds of plankton, these are different A, B, C, D, E, F, or different kinds of plankton, and you can see the cholera bacteria, which are stained with a specific monoclonal antibody ligated to a fluorescent molecule that allows us to see it under the UV microscope. So we can actually monitor very carefully now these bacteria in the water system. And the work done in Bangladesh has reinforced the work that we did in Chesapeake Bay, namely that the bacteria are associated with plankton, which in turn form a food for oysters and crabs, which then is a mechanism for transmission to humans. In Bangladesh, where you have conditions that allow person-to-person transmission, this factor, person-to-person transmission, becomes very important, but really it's the environment that's critical. Now, it occurred to us back in 1980, that's almost 40 years ago, when Landsat was launched, which is now kind of the granddad of satellites, we could measure sea surface temperature, sea surface height, and chlorophyll. And we did an experiment that really, at the time, was hugely simple. Namely, we simply took down in the Bay of Bengal, just point out, in the Bay of Bengal, just off the coast, we took a quadrant, and we measured sea surface temperature, sea surface height, and chlorophyll. And we then, over a period of time, from 1987 to about 2000, that period of time, we amassed the data for these sea measurements, along with the numbers of cases of cholera that are being admitted to the hospital in Bangladesh. And plotting the red line, I guess you can't see it very well, but it tracks really, really well. This was a very crude experiment using satellite sensors and numbers of patients coming down with cholera in Bangladesh, and it matched up so well that it became really quite exciting. And from there, we then developed further models. This was done by Constantine de Magny, a postdoc from Montpellier, France, who is now working in Africa using models to predict cholera in Mozambique and Senegal. But we could work this model pretty well so that with a milligram per cubic meter increase in chlorophyll measured by satellite imagery, we could predict about a third more cholera cases would occur in Calcutta, and with a millimeter per day increase in rain, about 7% more cases in Calcutta, and similarly in Madlab, Bangladesh. So the prediction was getting better, and of course now with the elegant work presented and done by Dr. Jutla, Dr. Bayantar, we've been able to, as he's described, predict where and pretty much the number of cholera cases, relatively speaking, in Haiti, and more recently, as he showed, in Yemen, the risk area that he described. So the models are improving, and they will continue to improve, and they're very useful. And again, the combination of satellites and sensors and the model that's been built up over the last 40 years of classical microbiology and then coupled with satellite imagery, we have a very confident and a very powerful database, both ground truth as well as satellite imagery for our predictions. Now let me describe a very interesting citizen science experiment that was done that we were able to utilize. I've described the cell, individual cell as a causative agent, the aggregation in the population and community structure, and then the ecosystem, that is the relationship to the environment of these organisms that are pathogenic for humans. Now we have seen over the last 50 years a shift in the plankton in the North Sea, in the Atlantic Ocean, around England and off the coast of North America, from the cold temperate species to warm temperate species of plankton, zooplankton, Calanus, the carrier of vibrios. We have found also, very interesting, that 45 years ago, Southampton Marine Laboratory carried out a citizen science experiment. What they did was provide yachtsmen, ferry boat operators, cruise ships with plankton nets so that they could do this continuous plankton recorder, essentially a length of silk that they could then use with a tow that they could collect plankton and send them to the Southampton laboratory. So in Southampton, in England, they have 40, 50 years now of data gathered by yachtsmen and crews of cruising ships. And so we also know that in the red squares, these are hotspots in the North Atlantic from satellite data where we know that the sea surface temperature has warmed over the last 50 years. So what we did was to take the samples that had been collected between 1961 through 2005, but actually continued even later. These samples then, we went back and extracted the DNA, and then we used specific probes for Vibrio cholerae, but also for the other pathogens, Vibrio parahemolyticus and Vibrio vulnificus. And we then did the relationship for each of the sites where the sea surface temperature had been rising. And you can see the little notations. The green are Vibrio parahemolyticus, the yellow are Vibrio cholerae, and the pink are Vibrio vulnificus. And as the temperature warmed, the increase in the detection of these Vibrios in those seawater samples. But what's even more to the point is that this increase in the numbers of Vibrios with the sea surface warming is correlated very nicely with increased incidence of human infections caused by these Vibrios in England, in northern part of the US, and in the western part of Europe. So I think this is probably, and this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2016. I think it's the first instance of a direct relationship of climate change and human infections being documented. So I think, I know this afternoon's discussion will be about citizen science, but I think this is a very elegant example of where it's very useful and very helpful. Now I want to tell you a little bit about where we are going. We are now beginning to develop a predictive model for the Chesapeake Bay for Vibrio vulnificus and parahemolyticus. Not so much Vibrio cholerae. We don't have cholera in Maryland. We used to have it in epidemics 100, 200 years ago. But we are now having increased numbers of infections with Vibrio vulnificus. It's a very nasty bacterium. If you are exposed to water that have the bacteria and you have a lesion, that is a wound or an abrasion or a cut, and the Vibrio vulnificus invades, death can ensue within 48 hours. It has a 50% death rate, and I have lectured several times in Maryland, in southern Maryland, where actual victims, survivors of Vibrio vulnificus have been in the audience. It's very important for us to be able to predict. So what we are doing is developing an elegant technique for being able to identify everything microscopic in water. Bacteria, viruses, fungus, and parasites. We extract the DNA. The community DNA then is sequenced. The raw sequence reads are then matched up against a database. We have a very elegant database of 165,000 and growing every day as we add to it. Sequences for bacteria, viruses, fungus, and parasites. This allows us then to identify the bacteria, and the identified bacteria then are matched up against a library of gene sequences for antibiotic resistance, for pathogenic properties, for metabolic properties, and that allows us to identify, but also to characterize all of the bacteria and the viruses and the fungus and the parasites in water systems. Now, why are we doing this? Because we would like to be able to, this is very accurate, by the way, in a publication matching all of the available algorithms for identifying microorganisms. we proved, you can see the red outlined area, that is the technique that we have developed. It's the most accurate, and it identifies to species and strain. Now, because it's the way we use the identification is to construct a phylogenetic tree. So the identification is to match on the tree, not by taxonomy, because we know taxonomic names can often be erroneous. So this is highly accurate and very rapid. Once we have the sequence, it's within 10 minutes. We have complete identification of everything, bacteria, viruses, fungus, parasites, to strain. Why does it matter to get down to strain? Because, for example, in the dairy industry, you can have a Lactobacillus casei species, but a single strain is used to make cheese, another strain is used to make Chardonnay, and a third strain is used to make yogurt. So strain is very, very important. And for us humans, if we have we all have E. coli in our gut, they help us by producing vitamins and protecting against invading pathogens. But if we're unlucky enough to get the 015787 strain, then we are in deep trouble with the infection from hemorrhagic enteritis. We've been doing analyses, and you may wonder why I'm going into this detail. And that's because I want you to understand that as we move into the future, we are going to be going after the hard to detect in water systems bacteria like Salmonella, Shigella, and be able to begin to correlate with environmental conditions for the outbreaks that occur, particularly in the developing countries. So what we have done is work closely with Calcutta, the team at the hospital in Calcutta, the National Hospital for Cholera and Enteric Diseases, where they do routinely, by classical techniques, all of the bacteria, parasites, and virus detection. And by comparing their capability of being able to identify using classical techniques, the upper left, known etiology, the pink area are the pathogens. What we have found is that they don't carry, when they come into the hospital, just Vibrio cholerae. They also carry 4 to 10 other pathogens, including parasites as well as other bacteria and viruses. Where they could not identify the causative agent, we were able to identify. These were mostly E. coli. And then we had downloaded from the NIH database the healthy gut flora of us Westerners. And we do not carry very many pathogens, but the healthy Indian controls, the bottom left, you can see that the average healthy individual does carry a larger number of pathogens. Now the point is, because we can look at water systems, and we're doing this work with Orange County, California, we're able then to, in this very elegant wastewater recycling, if you're in Los Angeles, 50% of the water that goes into the drinking water plant is from the sewage plant, so it's recycled. What we've been able to do is show that by their microfiltration, reverse osmosis, and advanced oxidation techniques, and looking at samples at each step of the way, we're able to show that indeed lots of bacteria, including pathogens, when it gets through that first step, but by the time it gets through the third and pre-chlorination step, all that's left are just the water bacteria that are normal and safe, and the bacteria that we drink when we drink tap water. This is not sterile, but it's safe. And this is true as well for antibiotic resistance genes. That is, by the time it gets through the various filtration processes, it is relatively free of antibiotic resistance. And this was important because the concern was that sewage bacteria were transferring antibiotic resistance genes to the healthy, normal water bacteria, but that doesn't occur. Now, we've looked at different water sources. So we're building ground truth for processing plant water, tidal freshwater, river water, brackish river water, reclaimed water, pond water, and non-tidal freshwater creeks. We already now are building this massive database to be able to determine what kinds of microorganisms and what kind of antibiotic resistance genes would be picked up. This then will allow us to use the satellite imagery then to begin to develop the environmental parameters that we can then be able to predict just outbreaks, let's say, of typhoid in Rwanda, or predict an outbreak of Campylobacter in Ethiopia. So we can get to, I think, much more elegant and sophisticated prediction techniques with the tools in the future. I'm going to close now by just an example of where I think it is really important as scientists, and I think the discussion by our congressman this morning was, Congressman Foster, was very useful, and that is to be aware of how we can serve the community. Having worked in Bangladesh for 45 years and having developed very sophisticated immunological, molecular genetic, genomic techniques, utilizing satellite imagery, what could we do for the average villager in the remote parts of Bangladesh, where they depend on water for drinking, for sanitation, for laundry, directly from the environment? Because we had found that plankton carry the cholera bacteria, and the plankton carried 10 to several hundred cholera bacteria, even 1,000 per plankton species. We worked out, I won't go into all the detail because time is short, but we worked out that by using simple sari cloth, folded about 4 times and use sari cloth, you could filter out 90% of the cholera bacteria. And the water, you can see the bottom to the right is quite clear. To the left, it's very cloudy with us swimming about in it. The women are the ones who collect water for the family, and training them how to fold the sari cloth, put it over the calash when they're collecting the household water, we were able to reduce cholera by 50%. So this is utilizing the science that we've got for social benefit and well-being. It's a sideline to all the interesting science that we're doing, but it helps the villagers. So safe water is a global challenge, and I think the work that we are discussing today leads us to one aspect, at least, of providing safe water for healthy populations. And the words of John Muir, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he, and I've inserted and she, finds it hitched to the rest of the universe. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions if we have time.
We have time for a few questions, definitely, and then we'll add a little time on to lunch.
Okay. Probably all hungry.
You have any questions?
Yes.
As the cost of doing this DNA sequencing, the equipment, to do this.
Yes.
I'm just curious, what kind of investment is necessary to create a system, building this database and be able to sample on a much larger scale across the planet?
Well, the cost has gone down from thousands of dollars for sequencing a single bacterium to probably a couple $100. But even more to the point, the sequencing machines have come down from $1 million to several $100,000. But the Oxford Nanopore company in England has produced a handheld kind of a shoebox sized for $20 that you can go out into the field. It's not very accurate yet, but it's getting there. So I think, and my hope and ambition is that we will have a kind of a tricorder, if you will, a handheld device that a physician can use in Bangladesh or in Washington, D.C. when a patient comes into the office, and when the patient leaves, have an accurate diagnosis of what the infective agent is, or the infective agents are, and what antibiotics to be able to treat with. And we're getting there. So to set up a lab now, we're in the process of expanding our lab, is maybe a couple $100,000, but an analysis can be done for a couple $100.
Please state your name and affiliation before asking a question.
Ray Petrushin. One of the things that in thinking about this is it's kind of the end game that one is playing, because this is a continuous process. I mean, every bacteria can undergo mutation every 20 minutes or every cell division or whatever. Well, so how does one keep up with this or make it more than just an exercise in, a difficult exercise?
Well, the Vibrio cholerae, the cholera bacterium is even worse because it laterally transfers and shares up to 80% of its genes. And so I think what is very, very useful is that we can, by this combination of genomics and satellite environmental parameters, we're able to track molecular genetically epidemics at the same time being able to predict where they would migrate to. And again, I liked the discussions, the panel, the comment about weather, because I think it would be very, very helpful, for example, to have for Chesapeake Bay a Vibrio parahemolyticus index for the watermen. They're the ones most likely to be affected by this, and to be able to tell them during times of the year, hey, be very careful when you're in certain parts of the Patuxent. So I think we're getting to that point, and it's really quite exciting. And I'm grateful to NASA for the support that it provides. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.